Right now are the bells sounding, calling members to the floor of the House of Representatives to listen to this landmark speech. As you know, this was the budget that wasn't supposed to happen. Less than a fortnight ago, it had been widely expected that we'd be in the middle of an election campaign by now. That was until Cyclone Alfred blew those plans away. Instead, the Treasurer will make Labor's economic pitch tonight for re-election. Then on Thursday evening, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, will make the coalition's case in his budget reply. Now, these two speeches this week will tell us a lot about the election campaign to come. Immediately after the Treasurer's speech tonight, stay with the ABC for unrivalled analysis of the budget. Sarah Ferguson will bring you the first post-budget interview with Jim Chalmers, and later, David Speers will assemble some of the sharpest minds in politics for a midweek Insiders. This is the live shot from the House of Representatives, where the Treasurer will give his speech any moment now. The Speaker, Milton Dick, stepping up. Let's take you live now to the floor of the House of Representatives and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
I have received a message from Her Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2025-2026, and I call the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I present the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 25-26 and the explanatory memorandum.
Thank you. I call the Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
And I give the call to the Treasurer.
I move that the bill be now read a second time, and I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people here and the Yuggera and the Yugambeh back home. Speaker, this budget builds on the progress that we have made together. It's a plan to help with the cost of living, with 2 new tax cuts and higher wages, more bulk billing and more help with electricity bills, cheaper medicine and less student debt. It's a plan to build Australia's future, with more homes, new investments in skills and education, competition reforms and a future made in Australia. Speaker, our economy is turning the corner. Inflation is down, incomes are rising, unemployment is low, interest rates are coming down, debt is down, and growth is picking up momentum. On all of these fronts, our economy and our budget are in better shape than they were 3 years ago. Now, this progress has been exceptional but not accidental. The credit belongs to Australians in every corner of our country. We've come a long way together, but there is more work to do. This budget is our plan for a new generation of prosperity in a new world of uncertainty. It's a plan to help finish the fight against inflation, rebuild living standards and maximise our national advantages into the future. This is a responsible budget with 5 main priorities: helping with the cost of living, strengthening Medicare, building more homes, investing in every stage of education, and making our economy stronger, more productive and more resilient. Speaker, the global economy is volatile and unpredictable. The 2020s have already seen a global pandemic, global inflation and now the threat of a global trade war. The whole world has changed as a consequence. Tariffs and tensions abroad have been accompanied by storms here at home. Ex-tropical cyclone Alfred could wipe 1/4 percentage point off quarterly growth. North and far north Queensland have flooded too. Storm clouds are gathering in the global economy as well. Trade disruptions are rising. China's growth is slowing. War is still raging in Europe and a ceasefire in the Middle East is breaking down. Treasury expects the global economy to grow 3.25% for the next 3 years, its slowest since the 1990s. It's already forecasting the 2 biggest economies in the world will slow next year, with risks weighing more heavily on both. Australia is neither uniquely impacted nor immune from these pressures. but we are among the best placed to navigate them. We're emerging from this spike in global inflation in better shape than almost any other advanced economy. Growth is forecast to pick up from 1.5% this year to 2.5% in 2026-27. The private sector is resuming its rightful place as the main driver of this growth, with Treasury upgrading forecasts for growth in private demand to more than double next year compared to this one. Unemployment is now projected to peak lower at 4.25%. Employment and real wage growth this year will be stronger, and participation will stay near its record high for longer. Inflation is coming down faster as well. Treasury now expects inflation to be sustainably back in the band 6 months earlier than anticipated. Now, all of this means that the soft landing that we have been planning for and preparing for is now looking more and more likely. Because of our collective efforts, the worst is behind us and the economy is now heading in the right direction. But there's more work to do because we know that people are still under pressure. The cost of living is front of mind for most Australians, and it is front and centre in this budget. We know the welcome improvements in the aggregate numbers don't always immediately translate to how people are feeling and faring. We've made a lot of progress together, but we know that many people are still doing it tough. Our plan to rebuild living standards starts with cost of living help and wages growth. It includes more hip pocket help for households, 2 new tax cuts for every taxpayer, more energy bill relief, increasing wages and reforming non-compete clauses, more bulk billing and cheaper medicines, student debt relief, and a fair go for families at the checkout and for farmers at the farm gate. Speaker, tonight the government is proud to be delivering more tax relief. Every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut next year and the year after to top up the tax cuts which began in July. This will take the first tax rate down to its lowest level in more than half a century. These additional tax cuts are modest, but they will make a difference. The average earner will have an extra $536 in their pocket each year when they're fully implemented. Combined with our first round of tax cuts, this is $2,190, and the average total tax cut will be $2,548, or about $50 a week. We will also increase the Medicare levy low-income thresholds, which is extra tax relief for more than 1 million Australians. Now, our $17 billion in tax cuts are the biggest part of the responsible cost of living package in this budget, but they're not the only part. Mr Speaker, electricity prices in the official data went down 25% last year, but they're still putting pressure on households around the world. 2 rounds of energy rebates have helped take some of the sting out of energy costs. Tonight we're providing another $1.8 billion in energy bill relief. Every household and around 1 million small businesses will receive energy rebates until the end of 2025. This means cutting another $150 off bills this year. The government will also be using the powers and penalties of the energy regulators and the ACCC to help ensure that energy companies offer customers cheaper deals, that pensioners receive the discounts that they are entitled to, and that Australians get the value that they deserve. Mr Speaker, at the core of our economic plan and at the very heart of this Labor government is a simple objective: to ensure more Australians earn more and keep more of what they earn. In the 5 quarters before our first budget, real wages fell in annual terms. They have now grown for the last 5. Real incomes per capita are now growing too. This is the dividend of our economic plan to get inflation down and wages up and tax cuts flowing. Tonight we're providing an additional $2.6 billion to fund pay rises for aged care nurses from March this year, so that the workers that we trust to care for our parents and grandparents get paid properly for the work that they do. We're reforming non-compete clauses to lift wages by up to $2,500 a year for workers covered by them. We've supported an historic wage increase for the early childhood educators and care workforce. And we've backed pay rises which ensure the national minimum wage has risen by almost $7,500 a year. Speaker, we know that Australians, despite all of this, are still under pressure, and a lot of that pressure is felt at the checkout. That's why we're cracking down on the supermarkets. By empowering the competition watchdog, making the food and grocery code mandatory, increasing penalties and boosting competition. At the same time, we're targeting excessive surcharging and scams and unfair trading practices that harm consumers. Speaker, a university education is a life-changing opportunity, but it shouldn't leave Australians with a lifetime of debt. This year we will cut 20% off all student loan debts, raise the minimum repayment threshold and reduce repayment rates. Combined with our existing student debt relief, we will slash $19 billion in debt for more than 3 million Australians. Speaker, in every budget, including this one, we have made medicines cheaper. Tonight we reduced the maximum price for a PBS script from $31.60 to $25. And pensioners and concession card holders will still pay $7.70 a script because we froze their costs as well. We're also investing $1.8 billion to list more life-changing and life-saving medicines on the PBS. For example, cutting the cost of a lymphoma treatment will save some Australians more than $600,000. Speaker, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is a great Labor creation and it's a great Australian institution. And we are strengthening it because Australians need us to, not weakening it because American multinationals want us to. A Labor government created Medicare as well, and only Labor governments strengthen it. Tonight we are proud to make the single biggest commitment to Medicare since its creation. A record $8.5 billion to lift bulk billing rates and build our health workforce. Because of this investment, 9 out of 10 GP visits should be fully bulk billed by the end of the decade. More bulk billing will mean less pressure on families. These incentives mean there will be around 4,800 fully bulk billing practices around the country, making it easier to see a doctor and get the care that you need, and saving patients around $860 million a year. This budget also delivers new incentives for doctors to train as GPs, new scholarships for nurses and midwives, and another 50 Medicare urgent care clinics. This is a $644 million investment in this budget to build on the 87 urgent care clinics that we've already opened. 4 in every 5 Australians will live within a 20-minute drive of an urgent care clinic as a consequence. Opening early, closing late, available on weekends, taking pressure off hospitals and emergency departments, and all you need is your Medicare card. Every single state and territory will also get more money for hospitals in this budget, funding that will reduce waiting times. Tonight we're locking in an extra $1.8 billion, taking our total contribution to public hospitals to $33.9 billion next year. Speaker, we're proud to be investing $793 million in this budget in women's health to create more choices and lower costs and deliver better health care for women. This funding will help Australian women save on contraception, access more endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics, and receive better support through menopause. Because for our government, women's health is not a boutique issue or a question of special interest, it is a national priority. Speaker, new plans for cost of living and health are accompanied by new investments in housing. We are tackling the housing shortage from every responsible angle, making home ownership more affordable for young Australians and for young families in particular. Our $33 billion plan will help build 1.2 million new homes before the decade is out. This includes $54 million to accelerate the uptake of modern methods of housing construction, which is all about building more homes more quickly. It supports our work to cut red tape and reduce financial barriers to more efficient construction methods. The first two rounds of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund are helping to build about 18,000 social and affordable homes for those who need them most. And lifting the cap on Housing Australia's financial liabilities to $26 billion also helps in this regard. We're making sure new properties are well located and connected to the infrastructure that they require. Our housing support program is funding the crucial roads, water and power that these new homes need. Our national leadership is incentivising states and territories to reform their planning systems to accelerate new housing supply. And to build more, we know that we also need to train more builders. That's why we're attracting more apprentices into the housing industry by doubling incentive payments so that eligible apprentices get up to $10,000 if they train up in the housing construction sector. Speaker, tonight we're expanding our Help to Buy scheme as well. This is part of our efforts to help ensure more Australians can buy a place of their own. We will update the property price and income caps so more first home buyers are eligible for the scheme. And this will help 40,000 Australians buy their first home in the next 4 years. And the changes mean that they can access a bigger range of homes and buy one that suits them. And we're easing pressure on the housing market by banning foreign investors from buying established homes and cracking down on foreign land banking as well. Speaker, a crucial part of this Labor government's economic plan relies on the transformational power of education, its power to turn aspiration and ambition into reality. And this is why we're investing in every stage of education, to lay the foundation for a better and fairer system and teach and train Australians for the jobs of the future. Speaker, this all starts with early childhood education and care. We believe every child has the right to an early education to ensure that they don't start school behind. Cheaper childcare is also cost of living relief with an economic dividend. A key part of our plan to rebuild living standards is to help people work more and earn more if they want to. That means breaking down the barriers to workforce participation. So from January 2026, we are replacing the childcare subsidy activity test with a new 3-day guarantee. This will make sure families are entitled to at least 3 days a week of subsidised early childhood education and care. We're also building more childcare centres in areas of need, investing $5 billion to expand access across the country and lift the wages of early educators, and charting a path to universal early education and care regardless of a child's background or no matter where they live. Speaker, we're also putting billions into public schools in this budget to open the doors of opportunity for more Australian children. We're fully and fairly funding public schools to help students catch up, keep up and finish school. This means public schools will finally be on track to reach the funding standard recommended in the Gonski Review almost 15 years ago. On top of this, our fee-free TAFE program will help equip Australians for the jobs of the future. Over the next decade, 9 out of 10 new jobs will require post-secondary qualifications. Almost half of these will be from vocational training. We've introduced legislation to lock in 100,000 free TAFE places annually from 2027, and we've committed $1.6 billion to fund these places until 2035 to make it easier for Australians to train, retrain and upskill. Speaker, we see this as an important way, or one way, to ensure Australians can be primary beneficiaries of all of this churn and change that we're seeing around the world. Another is by investing in our comparative advantages, or by looking for opportunities to join with our partners in new, more resilient global supply chains, by becoming an indispensable part of the global net zero economy, by preparing our people to adjust to and succeed in the new world being created right in front of us, by building a future made in Australia. Now, a big part of this depends on boosting productivity the right way, to lift living standards over the long term. Now, our plan for productivity growth doesn't mean making Australians work longer for less. It's about investing in our people and doing more to unlock our potential by boosting dynamism and competition in our economy. We've created a $900 million fund to reward state governments for implementing reforms that promote competition. And tonight we are advancing this substantial economic reform agenda. We will abolish non-compete clauses for most Australian workers. Non-competes are holding too many Australians back from switching to better, higher-paying jobs. More than 3 million Australians are captured by these clauses, including childcare workers, construction workers and hairdressers. People shouldn't need to hire a lawyer to take the next step in their career, or permission from their old boss if they want to be their own boss and turn an idea into a small business. The Productivity Commission estimates that this reform could lift productivity, reduce inflation and improve GDP by $5 billion. And it could boost wages by up to 4%. We're also introducing a national licensing scheme to allow electricians to work seamlessly across borders. This will be a template for expanding national licensing to other occupations when and where we can. The PC suggests that these broader licensing reforms could boost GDP by up to $10.3 billion. Mr Speaker, Australia is well placed to respond to the 5 seismic challenges shaping this new world of uncertainty. The shift from globalisation to fragmentation, from hydrocarbons to renewables, from information technology to AI, from a younger population to an older one, and all of the changes in our industrial base. Now, all of this puts a premium on resilience, and that's what a future made in Australia is all about. In this budget, we're investing more than $3 billion to support the production of Australian-made green metals like aluminium and iron, building on the tax incentives for critical minerals and green hydrogen that we legislated last year. We're also backing clean technologies through our Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund and by recapitalising the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. This will help develop new industries in clean energy manufacturing, green metals and low-carbon liquid fuels, and unlock more private investment. This agenda is about recognising that our future growth prospects lie at the intersection of our industrial, resources, skills and energy bases and our attractiveness as an investment destination, so that we can grasp the jobs and opportunities of the net zero transformation. Speaker, in difficult conditions, around 25,000 new businesses have been created each month on average since we came to office. Now, we respect and admire the hard work and aspiration and sacrifice behind those record numbers, which is why we're going into bat for small and local businesses in this budget, protecting them from unfair trading practices, funding our Buy Australian campaign to support local producers, providing new resources for the regulator to level the playing field for smaller players, and delivering tax relief for hospitality venues, brewers, distillers and wine producers as well. Speaker, building Australia's future also means building on the strength of our regions. That's why we're securing banking services in country towns and flights in the bush. It's also why we're investing up to $3 billion in additional equity to complete the rollout of the national broadband network. Infrastructure like the NBN is essential for communities and students and businesses and to the productivity of our nation. And so are the roads and railways connecting our regions to our cities and supporting economic growth. This budget provides $17.1 billion over 10 years for these projects, including $7.2 billion to upgrade the Bruce Highway in Queensland, the biggest ever investment in the Bruce, $2.3 billion for Western Sydney, with $1 billion of that for the rail network alone, and $2 billion towards transforming Sunshine Station, taking our Melbourne Airport rail investments to $7 billion. In total, we're investing more than $120 billion in infrastructure in every state and territory over the decade, improving the productivity, resilience, livability and sustainability of our cities, regions and communities, accompanied by $262 million to preserve and conserve our natural land and our ocean assets. Speaker, in these uncertain times, economic security and national security are increasingly intertwined. We're supporting stability and prosperity in our region by helping to shore up banking services in the Pacific. We've invested an extra $50 billion in defence by the mid-2030s to help keep Australians safe. It means defence funding will grow beyond 2.3% of GDP by the early 2030s. And we're investing $45 million in our initial response to the independent intelligence review. So, Mr Speaker, in a tight budget, we've made room to boost our defences, strengthen Medicare, help people doing it tough, build more homes and invest in the future. We've done all of this at the same time as we've overseen the biggest ever fiscal improvement in a single term of government. Yeah. Tonight's budget is $207 billion better than we inherited. Yeah. It's in better shape in every year over the forward estimates than it was 3 years ago. In our first 2 years, we posted the first back-to-back surpluses in nearly 2 decades. Yeah. Our deficit this year has almost halved since we came to office. Next year's deficit is $42 billion, lower than what was forecast at the last election and lower than at the mid-year update. Gross debt will hit $940 billion this financial year, $177 billion lower than what we inherited. Yeah. This means we'll avoid around $60 billion in interest costs over the decade. These are some of the dividends of our responsible economic management, achieved through a combination of spending restraint, finding savings and banking revenue upgrades. Real payments growth is forecast to average 1.7% to 28-29, less than half of the average under our predecessors. We've found around $94 billion of savings since coming to government, including another $2 billion in this budget. In this term, we've banked around 70% of tax receipt upgrades, and we've made structural improvements to the budget across the NDIS, aged care and interest costs as well. And Speaker, we're repairing the budget without ignoring our responsibility to build a stronger, fairer and more inclusive society, where more Australians have the chance to contribute and share in our economic success. We're providing $1.3 billion for closing the gap and economic self-determination for First Nations Australians, with investments in remote community services, opportunities for business and support for home ownership. Tonight's budget also includes $424 million for Australians with a disability and more funding for aged care reform. There's more money to support veterans and build on the progress that we have made eliminating that backlog of claims. And we're providing help to Australians and communities affected by natural disasters, provisioning another $1.2 billion to properly fund recovery from ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, as part of $13.5 billion in natural disaster funding for further north and right around the country. So, Mr Speaker, it's even more important and even more remarkable that Australia's economy is turning the corner when we know that the global economy is taking a turn for the worse. Our progress and our prospects validate and vindicate the decisions and the sacrifices that we've made together as Australians to bring inflation and debt down, to get wages and growth up, and to keep unemployment low. And what really matters is that we build on this platform, how we help finish the fight against inflation, how we keep rebuilding living standards, and how we maximise our national advantages to benefit Middle Australia. The plan at the core of this budget is about more than putting the worst behind us. It's about seizing the best of what's ahead of us, to build a stronger economy together and to build a future that we can all be proud of. And that's why I commend this bill and this budget to the House.
was the Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering his fourth budget. Hello, I'm Sarah Ferguson and welcome to this special edition of 7:30. In a moment, the Treasurer will begin to make his way to the 7:30 studio for his first post-budget interview. And later, you'll hear from the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor for the opposition's response, including to the government's headline announcement, a tax cut for all Australians. This was the budget the Treasurer never planned to deliver until Cyclone Alfred delayed the Prime Minister's plan to send Australians to the polls. Now it becomes the final centrepiece before the 2025 cost of living election gets underway. Here's National Affairs correspondent Jane Norman bringing you the main elements of today's budget.
An economic blueprint with an eye to the electoral endgame.
Hello, Treasurer, hello.
Delivering his fourth budget on the eve of an election, Jim Chalmers saved one big sweetener.
Will these tax cuts win you the election?
This budget is obviously being delivered on the eve of an election, but it's driven by economics, not politics.
Labor will reduce the lowest tax rate from 16 to 15% from July next year and to 14% the year after. It means the average worker earning $79,000 will get a tax cut of $268 or around $5 a week in 2026, doubling to $536 or $10 a week in 2027. The cost to the budget, $17 billion over 5 years.
Can we actually afford it?
Yes, we can, and we're providing these tax cuts in the most responsible way that we can.
The government will also ensure 1 million Australians avoid the full Medicare levy by increasing the threshold at which it's paid. It comes on top of a suite of cost of living measures, lowering power bills through a $150 rebate, making medicines cheaper by capping the cost of PBS-listed medicines at $25, and increasing incentives paid to doctors to drive up bulk billing rates. $35 billion in new policies paid for by a $36 billion windfall, Treasury finding a bit of wriggle room in the budget.
On top of existing spending, Labor's back-to-back surpluses will become a decade of deficits. This year's deficit marginally better than forecast at $27.6 billion, rising rapidly next year before falling back to around $37 billion in 4 years' time. Including off-budget spending adds another $104 billion over the next 5 years. It's all driving up net debt. $556 billion this year, growing to $770 billion by 2028-29.
As the budget slides deep into the red,
keep smiling.
The government's focusing on the positives.
We've got the bottom line better in every single year than the bottom lines that we inherited when we came to these positions.
Even with income tax cuts, the budget bottom line is increasingly bolstered by the tax take from workers, particularly as once lucrative levies dwindle. Revenue from the tobacco excise has gone up in smoke as the cigarette black market explodes. Treasury wiping $6.9 billion from expected revenue over 5 years.
There is an issue when it comes to tobacco excise. There's a big hit in the budget.
If there's one word that sums up the budget, it's uncertainty. Whether it's the threat of US trade tariffs, a slowdown in the Chinese economy, or wars in Europe and the Middle East.
Despite these global shocks, Australia's economic growth is gaining momentum. GDP rising from 1.5% this year to 2.75% in 4 years' time. Aided by another round of power bill rebates, inflation's back to 2.5% within the Reserve Bank's target range and staying there. It means workers are forecast to get a real wage rise each year from here as wages growth outpaces the cost of living.
Wages for some could rise further, with Labor vowing to ban non-compete clauses, allowing workers to move more easily between jobs.
We are genuinely turning a corner in our economy. A story of Australian exceptionalism in the context of global economic uncertainty.
The Treasurer hoping his budget offerings are exceptional enough for voters to give Labor a second term.
Budget night is part spending and taxing announcements and part a story about where the economy is headed. Here's 7:30's political editor Laura Tingle with her analysis.
In next week's budget, we'll have a bit more to say.
We can talk about these things in almost exactly a week's time. I don't intend to announce any cost of living help that will be in the budget next week.
You'll see all of the decisions the government's made through our budget.
Politics is a game perpetually in flux. We are either assessing things that have happened or, it feels increasingly, waiting for something to happen or land, whether that's a policy announcement, a budget or an election date, before we can make a judgment. Budgets are a particular case in point. They are mostly reported in terms of what surprises they contain or whether they are enough. But they are also an opportunity to freeze time for a moment and assess where the economy has come from and where it is going to, as well as what the government might be doing for us individually. That's particularly important as we approach the end of the parliamentary term and, as voters, are weighing up what the government of the day has achieved and whether it deserves our support. Or, as Opposition Leader Peter Dutton said a couple of weeks ago,
I just say to all Australians, look at what a government or a political party does, not what they say they will do.
if we look at what the government has done, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has framed his fourth budget as a report card on the first term of the Albanese government, comparing the government's record on spending, tax and economic growth against the so-called pre-election economic and fiscal outlook from 2022, which set out for all sides of politics where the economy and budget were up to at that time. Times, of course, were still grim then. The economy was just coming out of a pandemic. There is a much more confident tone to the Treasurer's language and the budget forecasts than we have seen in some time. The lurking fear that a recession is not far away has disappeared.
We've got inflation down, wages and incomes are up, unemployment is low, we've got the debt down, interest rates have started to be cut, and now growth is rebounding solidly as well.
All this is true. For the first time in the post-war era, we have avoided a recession after a significant inflation shock. Most people kept their jobs. Credit for that might go largely to the Reserve Bank, but the criticisms of the government that it should have cut spending more to help get inflation down faster now have to be judged against the fact that inflation has fallen and the private sector is set to take over from the public sector as the driver of growth. In dollar terms, that means growth in the economy is forecast to add $36.4 billion to the budget, which will in turn fund $34.8 billion of policy decisions outlined tonight. That is, the government strategy has worked. The Treasurer tonight argued that the budget was $207 billion better off than it was when Labor came to office, and that about half of that was due to spending cuts, or at least restraint. Things have been really difficult for millions of Australians. The $17 billion tax cuts announced in the budget, which had not been expected, will give angry voters, particularly those who have been disillusioned and disengaged, a reason to at least pay a little more attention. And once the government has their attention, it can point to the other cost of living measures it has been rolling out, including energy relief, Medicare bulk billing, and cutting pharmaceutical prices. And once again, it can point out the Coalition's past opposition to many of those measures. The forecasts suggest, if not sunlit uplands, a slightly kinder economy in the next year or two, in which people will enjoy lower interest rates, more disposable income, and a faster growing economy as the rate of annual growth lifts from 1.5 to 2.5%. Judged against what they said they would do, the government scores pretty well in this budget. As to the question of what it should do, that is, be more ambitious, reform more, the tax cuts will at the margin appease calls for tax reform for the time being. The budget gives the government an alibi for most issues going into the election campaign, which will make the Coalition's critiques of its strategy look somewhat pallid. The opposition has to make some quick decisions about whether it has any choice but to match what the government does. One issue that will remain contentious is migration. The budget papers are forecasting a net overseas migration number of 225,000 by 2027. Last week, the figure for the year to September was released. It was 380,000. And Treasury admits that number was not taken into account in its new forecast. Higher migration is already a target of the Coalition, and this forecast is likely to be an easy point of attack as it considers how it responds to this budget and tells us what it says it will do.
There are two overarching narratives in the Treasurer's presentation today. One is about Australia's economy turning a corner. The other is the threats to the economy from the global disorder. They both exist within the urgent demands of a federal election. The Treasurer joins me now. Welcome, Treasurer, and
Thanks
congratulations on your highly unusual fourth budget.
I appreciate it, Sarah. Thanks.
Now, budgets, as we know, are about choices. You've chosen to give every Australian worker a tax cut, spending $17 billion, as we've heard. Why are you giving a tax cut to you and to me?
Well, this is about topping up a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, in addition to the tax cuts which are already rolling out from July last year. And so we know that they're modest in isolation, but we think meaningful in combination with all of the tax cuts that we've provided and the other cost of living help that we are rolling out. Now, when it comes to the design of the tax cuts, in order to give a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, the benefits are felt disproportionately to people we are encouraging into work. Younger workers, women, people on lower and middle incomes, they will proportionately be the biggest beneficiaries of these topped-up tax cuts, in addition to the tax cuts already rolling out.
Topped-up tax cuts, but they're still political. Have you stolen Peter Dutton's thunder here?
Well, I see these tax cuts in economic terms, and it's partly in recognition that even as we make this really quite remarkable progress together as Australians in the fight against inflation, we know that people are still under pressure. And so we're providing cost of living relief. Really one of the defining features of this budget is the cost of living relief that we're providing. Often the best way to do that is through the tax system. So we see it in terms of cost of living. We see it in terms of the economic benefits to participation. We found room in a pretty tight budget to provide these tax cuts. The politics will take care of themselves.
Are they fiscally responsible, though, in the environment we have?
Yes, they are. And you know, there's an appetite, obviously, and an enthusiasm often to provide bigger tax cuts. We have to provide the tax cuts we think the budget can afford, and we have to do that in the most responsible way. And that's what's guided us here, to give as much cost of living help as we can in the most responsible way, conscious of the pressures on the budget and also the pressures coming at us from around the world.
So put another way, the political advantage of the tax cuts, whether you want to engage with that or not, outweighs the impact on the budget.
Well, I think that's for others to determine. You know, I genuinely
but I'm here asking you.
Well, I genuinely believe that if you get the big economic decisions right, and we have overwhelmingly done that in the course of the last 3 years, I genuinely believe the politics will take care of themselves. Obviously, I'm not oblivious to the fact that this budget, this fourth budget, a very rare and cherished opportunity, is being delivered on the eve of an election, and it will set up a choice between Labor helping with the cost of living and Peter Dutton, whose secret cuts will make Australians worse off.
Just a question, have you ruled out an inflationary impact of these tax cuts that the RBA would be looking at?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, obviously, I briefed the Reserve Bank Governor on the budget. I do that for every budget and every budget update. I've done that for the last two Reserve Bank Governors, and I'll do that for as long as I'm in this job. I think it's important. So I've done that. Secondly, one of the most encouraging things about this budget is that Treasury's actually brought forward its expectations for when inflation gets sustainably in the target band. And so we've provided this cost of living relief in a responsible way, consistent with inflation lower and earlier, which is one of our key economic objectives.
But what about that specific question around whether or not there is an inflationary impact of these new tax cuts?
Well, we don't believe there is, for a couple of reasons. One, the timing. Secondly, there's a participation effect here. We're encouraging more people into the workforce, which is, one of our key objectives. But thirdly, we think we've got the magnitude right to provide some topped-up tax relief to every Australian taxpayer, but in the most responsible way we can. Now,
it is, as we are saying, of course, a pre-election measure that sits alongside the, I think, around $35 billion in pre-election announcements that you've made since January. How are you going to pay for all of those promises with these tax cuts now sitting on top?
Well, first of all, a large number of those commitments that we've announced over the course of the last few months were already provisioned for in the mid-year budget update. And
some were, not all, yeah.
Well, most of them were before tonight. The big mover, obviously, tonight has been the tax cuts. So if you think about the net policy decisions in the budget, about $35 billion, that is less than what our predecessors committed in their election budget, point number one. Point number two, half of that is the tax cuts, $17 billion in tax cuts. And point number three is $8 billion of that $35 billion was already in the MyEFO.
Now, you were fortunate in your previous budgets with record windfalls, obviously, especially from the mining exports. enabling you to post surpluses. So is what we are seeing now the true picture of your economic management with its unending long-term deficits?
Well, first of all, it's a popular misconception that the recovery in the budget was driven entirely by commodity prices.
I said largely, also tax receipts, but largely by very large...
Commodity prices played a welcome and significant role, as did the strength in the labour market. One of the things we should be proudest of as Australians is that we've got inflation down without seeing a spike in unemployment, and that's had benefits for the budget as well. We've been clear about that. But what matters is when you get those revenue upgrades, what you do with them. And we unusually banked most of those revenue upgrades, without which there wouldn't have been a surplus or a second surplus for the first time in almost 2 decades. Our predecessors spent most of those upgrades. We banked most of them, and that's why we had 2 surpluses.
I think what we're talking about now are the deficits into the future, not what your predecessors did. Let me put it to you in a different way. So over the term of this government, you've overseen the largest spending as a share of the economy since the mid-1980s, outside of crisis, of course. Who is going to pay for all of those commitments into the future?
Well, first of all, during COVID, for understandable reasons, spending as a share of the economy was about 1/3 of the economy. We got it all the way down below 1/4 of the economy, and it's settling a little bit higher than that, largely because of our responsibilities in the care economy and some of those unavoidable investments that we're making as a government. And so spending as a share of the economy is settling around the kind of 26s. It was up in the 31s, it got down to the 24s, and now it's settling slightly higher than that. And in every budget, whether it's the $94 billion in savings that we've found, the way we've banked upward revisions to revenue, the way we've shown spending restraint when it comes to real spending growth being half the pace of the 30-year average, all of that comes together to make room for our commitments, whether it's strengthening Medicare, providing cost of living help, or investing in the future.
Should we just give the audience the numbers again for what's going to happen to the deficit? $42 billion next year, 35.7 the year after. It's $179.5 billion. We're not talking about banking surpluses. We're talking about what you're going to do to attack that structural position of the budget.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the budget position cumulatively is $207 billion stronger than when we came to office. Okay, and that shouldn't be lightly dismissed. That's actually the biggest positive turnaround in any budget in a single parliamentary term ever, in nominal terms. That's the first point. Very, very important point, often neglected. Secondly, this year's deficit is almost half as big as what it was when we came to office. Thirdly, if you look at the overall position, the bottom lines in this budget, it is stronger than what it was only a few months ago in the mid-year budget update. And so we're chipping away. And we're also making sure we make a structural difference to the budget in the NDIS, aged care and interest costs.
Yes, actually, let me just ask you about NDIS, because on that particular measure, as you said, it's been a huge pressure on the budget. Yeah. Can you confirm that it's going to hit its reduced target for growth of 8% next year?
Yeah, we're on track for that for sure. We're seeing some very encouraging progress. And the thing that we're encouraged by is that we've been able to get the costs of the NDIS to a more sustainable growth rate, still growing quite quickly, but more sustainably, while we still meet our responsibilities to people who need and deserve the scheme.
Now, there's one other measure that people are talking about today I want to ask you about briefly, and that is the extraordinary increase in the, drop in the tobacco excise. This is a situation where the tax has caused enormous profit to bikies and criminals, a failed policy. How do you fix it?
Well, there's 2 ways that we get tobacco excise down. One's a good way and one's a bad way. The good way is more people give up the darts. That's a good thing.
Yep.
The bad way is more people avoid the excise, and there is a problem. I think we've spoken about this maybe at this set on other occasions. So we're investing more money in enforcement and compliance because we recognise there's a problem here, and we need to collect more of this excise because we've got a problem in people avoiding it.
Let me just let's just talk about how the politics of the big decisions in tonight's budget are going to play out politically. Obviously, we are in the teeth of an election. I think the opposition has responded to your tax cuts. They're calling them a cruel tax hoax. Now, what does that tell you about how these tax cuts are going to be received? There's strong language coming out from the opposition straight away. Is that because you stole Peter Dutton's thunder, or are we looking at a tax hoax.
Well, that's the first I've heard of it. Sounds like they're not supporting our tax cuts, and that's what happened last time we tried to give every Australian taxpayer a tax cut. They didn't support that either. Peter Dutton was so angry about that, he said we should call an election to prevent those tax cuts flowing into the pockets of every Australian taxpayer.
Isn't he entitled to have a legitimate concern about you piling a tax cut on top of already a budget suffering from a structural deficit whose numbers are eye-watering?
No, we've done this in a very responsible way. We're providing tax relief to every Australian taxpayer. If he doesn't support that, he should say so. If he's got alternatives, if he's got alternatives, he should come clean. And they've had 3 years now, and they still haven't come up or come clean on any costed or credible or coherent economic policies. Angus Taylor's colleagues don't take him seriously. It is an absolute bin fire of incompetence and inconsistency. And what it means is, and as he told your colleague David Speers, Peter Dutton says there'll be hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts. They've got to find $600 billion to pay for nuclear reactors. They can't do that without coming after Medicare. That's why they're not coming clean on their cuts. And this week, they need to come clean on their cuts, because these secret cuts that Peter Dutton has in mind for Australians will make people worse off.
That's a slogan, and I think what the audience wants to understand is how you intend to put policies in place that change the dynamics of the economy that we've heard people talking about all week. That is, we are relying on tax revenue. Right now, you've given you and me $5 or $10 in our pockets, but going forward, who else is going to pay for all of these promises you've made if it's not the taxpayer?
Well, the reason I think that's an unusual question tonight, Sarah, is I've just laid out in lots of detail the government's economic plan to help people with the cost of living, strengthen Medicare and make ourselves more resilient in the face of all of this global economic uncertainty. And all we ask is that 3 years into a 3-year parliamentary term that the opposition does the same thing, to come clean on their cuts and how much worse people will be off as a consequence.
Now, I want to talk about the global uncertainty, because during the next 3-year term, if you get another term, if re-elected, you could face an inflationary global trade war with the US, ongoing demands over Ukraine, and a worsening security situation with China. With all of that uncertainty, would it have been more prudent to tighten the budget now to increase the capacity to respond to crisis?
Well, there is a dark shadow from all of this global economic uncertainty over the world's economy and over our own economy and our budget. We're very upfront about that in the budget papers and in my budget speech tonight. We do think that there is substantial risk that these escalating trade tensions mean more inflation and less growth around the world, and we wouldn't be immune from that, but we wouldn't be uniquely impacted.
How concerned
either.
are you personally about that, about the situation, about the impact on Australia? Very
concerned, and to go back to your original question, that's why it's so important that we have got the budget in much better condition. It's why it's so important that we're rebuilding incomes and wages and household budgets, and why it's so important that we're investing in a more resilient, more competitive economy. One of the things that's unusual about this budget, being on the eve of an election, is it still has economic reform, abolishing non-compete clauses, a national regime for the electrical trades, and it still has savings. And that's because we recognise the best insurance policy against all this global economic uncertainty is a more resilient economy, stronger incomes and wages for Australians, and a budget in much better nick. We've made progress on all three fronts tonight, but there's more work to do.
Where is the room? Where would the money come from if you were compelled, let's say, by circumstances to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP?
Yeah, first of all, and I know you're asking a different thing, but first of all, we are dramatically increasing spending on defence, not as far as you just nominated, but it is a quite dramatic increase by historical standards, and we've made the room to do that. A combination of budget repair, and I mentioned the $200 billion improvement, and making room for our priorities. And in a tight budget, the fact that we've made room to help with the cost of living and strengthen Medicare and fund this increase in defence spending, all at the same time as we've got this year's deficit down, I think that augurs well for our ability to continue to make the right economic decisions for the right economic reasons, managing this global economic uncertainty, recognising that people are still under pressure, but more than recognising that, helping people who are doing it tough. When
you delivered your first budget, you said they were hard decisions for hard times, possibly harder times now. Are you going to be able to lay out to the Australian people in this election a plan that encompasses the future, not the situation, not the cost of living crisis you're dealing with now, but a genuine crisis in the Australian budget going forward? We've talked about tax, but a growing deficit up to $42 billion next year.
Yeah, I mean, it hits 42 and then it starts to trail away again. It gets back near balance towards the end of the medium term. But I accept the general proposition of your question. There are structural challenges in the budget. We've begun to address those. NDIS, aged care, interest costs, all of those are important ways that we're improving the structural position of the budget. But what I laid out tonight in the government's economic plan and in our fourth budget was a plan to help people in the here and now at the cost of living, but also a plan for the future. Investing in green metals, for example, investing in innovation, making sure that we are an indispensable part of the global net zero transformation. These are our aspirations for the future. We have taken an intergenerational approach to our economic plan, and I've laid that out tonight.
Jim Chalmers, thank you very much indeed, and congratulations, as I said at the beginning, on that very rare fourth budget.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. That's one political pitch, and in a moment we'll hear another from Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, who will no doubt give us his views on the tax cuts. But what do the numbers tell us? Here's political reporter Tom Crowley to put it in context.
On the eve of an election, a chance to take stock. After one term, how has Labor changed the budget? Jim Chalmers says he's left things in better nick. And it's true that while the debt and deficits are still there, they're smaller. Still, he's had a bit of help. Factors outside the government's control have added hundreds of billions of dollars to the bottom line above what was forecast. That is quite a windfall. Early on, Labor said it was being responsible by only spending a fraction of that, but that discipline has slipped. And in this budget, most of the windfall has been used. In the end, Labor's own choices have taken the budget further into the red. But of course, inflation is a big part of this story. It's inflation that created these windfalls by driving up the tax take. And it's inflation that made Labor feel it had to spend to ease the cost of living with energy bill relief, rent assistance, health subsidies, and now tax cuts. It's the price tag of politics, and it's nothing new. Every government this century has made choices that have worsened the bottom line overall. But where does that leave the budget for the future? Labor inherited a budget with spending booming in several areas. Aged care, Medicare, defence, the NDIS and debt costs were all growing much faster than the economy. 3 years later, it's a mixed bag. Debt costs are growing slower. So are aged care and the NDIS, thanks to new laws. But Medicare, defence and childcare spending are accelerating, and every category is still growing fast. And on the tax side, we've seen only tax cuts. So we're still spending more money than we're raising. That means a structural deficit as far as the eye can see. And that story is unlikely to change whoever wins the election. The coalition has been saying it can do better than this, but we have almost no detail to back that up. And what we do know is that they're matching most of Labor's spends and adding a few of their own. We're about to find out if they'll match these tax cuts too.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton gives his full-blown reply to the budget on Thursday evening. Today, it's the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor's role to deliver the first response. As recently as the weekend, he made it clear he was waiting to see the government's numbers before the opposition could commit to its policies. He joins me now. Angus Taylor, welcome.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
Let's be clear on these tax cuts. Do you or don't you support them?
Well, this is a big spending, big taxing budget, which is for the next 5 weeks, not for the next 5 years. And what we see in it is a promise of 70 cents a day in a year's time, which is going to do nothing to restore Australian standard of living to where it was when Labor came to power. There are better structural, fundamental solutions to the cost of living crisis. That's not what's being offered by Labor, and so we won't support what they're doing here. You do not support the tax cuts? No. Well, look, let's be clear. They are a cruel hoax. I mean, they are not a genuine tax cut. 70 cents a day, 73 cents a day in a year's time, when for a typical Australian family with a mortgage, they're paying an extra $50,000 over and above what they expected. We need a pathway back to the standard of living that Australians had when Labor came to power. That's not what's being offered by this budget. We don't get there until the end of the decade, and that's simply not good enough. Let's be clear, because the Treasurer just now described them as top-up tax cuts that went along with the previous tax relief that the government has offered during this term. So should the tax cuts have gone
further? Is that what you wanted to see?
No, what we're
further
saying,
and sooner?
if you manage the economy, you don't see a collapse in people's standard of living.
So there's no requirement for tax cuts?
What we think is there is a better way to make sure we restore prosperity in this country, we get back to the standard of living that we had when we were last in power and ahead of it. And that's what Australians are used to. That's not what Labor's offering in this budget. We don't get back to the standard of living, as I said, that Australians had when Labor came to power until the end of the decade.
Let's be absolutely clear. The opposition will not be offering tax cuts as part of its budget and reply as part of its election campaign
That's
policies.
not what I said. I said we do not support what Labor is putting forward today. We have already announced important tax cuts. We've said that small businesses should be given accelerated depreciation.
Sure, but we're talking about a tax cut for every Australian. Just let's be absolutely clear. We're not talking about specific taxes related to...
Sarah, can I challenge you on this? When a small business makes an investment...
Sure. I'm not saying it's unimportant.
That raises the prosperity of all Australians over time. That's how you get productivity. That's how you make sure we're getting ahead. That's how you get a standard of living that's rising all the time.
I just wanted to get some clarity on personal income taxes. You're not in favour. You will not be offering personal income taxes as part of the election.
That's not what I said. I said we will not be supporting what Labor has proposed in this budget, and that's what we're responding to tonight.
All right, let's go to the budget more broadly. How long will it take you, precisely will it take you to bring this budget that you've seen today back to surplus?
Well, we'll make sure that the economy grows faster than spending. That's rule one, and the most important rule when we re-establish the fiscal guardrails that were thrown out by Labor.
I think your colleague
that
Jane
ensures, Sarah,
within 10 years.
That over time you get back to budget balance. What we see in this budget, $170 billion of deficits, an extra $400 billion or so of spending and taxing since Labor came to power, and no pathway back to prosperity. Well, that's simply not good enough. So the fiscal rules that were in place, put in place by Peter Costello all those years ago, will re-establish. That makes sure and assures that we've got an economy that grows faster than spending. And that way you can manage the economy, provide prosperity and help Australians to get ahead.
All right, but no time frame on that. But let me ask you another question. You said on Insiders this weekend with my colleague David Speers that you'd wait until you saw the budget to decide how many public servants you're going to sack. You've seen the budget. What are the numbers?
Well, it's gone up again. So we're now at 41,000 additional public servants.
Do you intend
we have said, well,
do you intend to lose all of those?
Can I just answer your question?
Yeah.
We have said we'll get back to where we were pre-Labor government when we were last in power. And of course that was 41,000 less. So that's what we're aiming to get back to. We've seen quite a substantial increase in the numbers tonight, and of course that is adding to the costs that all Australians are having to pay, and it's one of the reasons why we've got red ink as far as the eye can see in this budget.
So to be clear, you're saying that you're going to bring forward a policy that will result in 41,000
We'll be
public
looking to get
servants
back to
losing
where
their
we
jobs.
were when we were last in government.
You were also waiting to see headroom what headroom there was in the budget to determine how much the opposition can afford to spend on defence. What is the number?
Well, I'm not going to preempt announcements that are going to be made over the coming weeks,
You did suggest
including
on
in the
Sunday
budget
that
reply.
you would be able to do that.
Well, I didn't say I was going to on your program tonight, Sarah.
No, but you did on Sunday. So you've seen the budget now. What's the answer?
I didn't say I was going to do it on your program, and I'm not going to do it on your program, and I'll leave
You said you needed to
I'll
see
leave
the
these
budget
announcements
to the
appropriate people at the appropriate time. What I will say, though, is that you will see us in the coming weeks focus on economic management, restoring our standard of living, delivering affordable, reliable energy, fixing housing supply, balancing that with immigration, and making sure that we keep Australians safe and secure in a world which is increasingly challenging. And you know, it's as uncertain a world as we have seen since World War II.
I'm short on time, but I want to ask you this. David Littleproud says that the Coalition will deliver cheaper gas prices within a year. Can you commit to the same thing?
We will absolutely be putting downward pressure on gas prices. I won't say more about that today, other than to say that they were lower when I was Energy Minister. And the reason they were lower is we made sure there was supply coming out of the ground and going into the Australian network. Australian gas, working for Australians. It's not complicated. This Labor government has absolutely failed to deliver that. And the problem with that is not only higher gas prices, but higher electricity prices, because the gas price plays such an important role in setting the electricity price.
Thank you, Angus Taylor, very much indeed for joining us and bringing us your first response to the government's new tax policy. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
And that's the programme for tonight. Our budget coverage continues with a special edition on Insiders with my colleague David Speers. Good night.
Jim Chalmers and Angus Taylor, as you saw there, have been grilled by Sarah Ferguson. It is time now to look at what this budget means for you, what it means for the country and, of course, for Labor's political fortunes heading into an election which is expected to be called, well, within days. Coming up, I'll be joined by veteran budget watcher Chris Richardson and Aruna Sathanapalli from the Grattan Institute. They've spent the day poring over the figures. What do the minor parties and independents think? I'll be joined by the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, as well as Allegra Spender and Jackie Lambie. And the ABC's Laura Tingle, Patricia Carvelis and Jacob Grieber will join me for their analysis of the policy and the politics of this pre-election budget. And a reminder about the ABC's Your Say campaign, your chance to tell us about the issues that will influence your vote at the election. Perhaps it is something covered by tonight's budget, perhaps not. Either way, we want to hear from you, so scan the QR code you can see on your screen there and have your say. First, a quick recap of some of the budget headlines. Every taxpayer will receive a modest tax cut under this government plan from July next year, and then another from 2027, mid-2027. The bottom tax rates being slightly lowered, and the benefit would then flow through the tax scales. The average earner would save $268 in year one and a total of $536 from year two. The government will seek to ban non-compete clauses for low and middle income workers like hairdressers and chefs and so on. This should help them shift to higher paying jobs and remove a bit of a handbrake on productivity. Most of the other measures in this budget were announced ahead of tonight, but a couple of things that did jump out in the budget books. Tobacco excise receipts, they continue to plunge down another $6.9 billion. Some of that due to fewer people smoking, much of it due to the growth of the black market trade in cigarettes. The NDIS is costing a little less than earlier forecasts. It's still rising, but the forecast payments are down nearly $4 billion. And the budget has returned to the red with a deficit of $27.6 billion this year and $42 billion next year. Gross debt will pass $1 trillion next financial year and net debt will rise to $620 billion. Plenty to unpack. We're going to start with Chris Richardson from Rich Insights and Dr Aruna Sathanapalli from the Grattan Institute. Very good evening and thank you for spending the day with us going through the budget. Let's get your big picture take, Aruna, firstly to you on this budget. Is it responsible?
Look, this is a budget that is clearly a pre-election budget and pretty clearly pitched at Middle Australia. I think it's pitched at the erosion of living standards that we've seen across the board through this period of inflation. We put out a policy wish list last week, ahead of the election. There are a few things here that are actually some sensible economic reforms across competition, early childhood education, but broadly a lot of the reform is still left for after the election.
What did they ignore from your wish list?
Well, I mean, we've got tax cuts, but not tax reform. We've got a boost to primary healthcare spending, which is good, but not the system reform that we need to see on how we spend. And we've got energy rebates rather than energy efficiency, and that change in how we use energy that is actually the durable savings that we need to see.
Let's talk a bit more about the tax cuts, not tax reform, as Aruna called them. Chris, these are modest. Jim Chalmers is calling them top-up tax cuts. He wants them to be seen as building on previous measures on tax relief and other cost of living relief. But what do you make of these tax cuts? They're worth $17 billion. They're now going to be politically contentious. We heard Angus Taylor saying they're not going to support them, the coalition. This is a cruel hoax, leaving open the option of maybe going with something a bit bigger in terms of tax relief. But what do you think of this $17 billion modest tax cut?
Well, it does say we will have a bit of tax competition for the election, but I'm not sure it's the right stuff or even terribly sensible. It's as Aruna says, it's not particularly tax reform. One reform that does stand out and is as big in terms of its potential impact on the pockets of families eventually is that reform to non-compete clauses that you mentioned. Those are the
Explain
things.
that to us.
Well, when you take a job, you know, it might be construction, childcare, whatever it is, you will typically sign some forms that say when you leave, you're not allowed to do whatever it is. You know, take a client with you, take some staff friends with you, do all sorts of things. Some of the things you're not allowed to do, you should be allowed to do. And all the evidence around the world is that if we let that happen, if we let people compete more, the clue is in the name with these non-compete clauses. If we can wind them back, we can get much better, much healthier outcome. That's the loveliest thing in the budget, and it won't get the headlines it deserves. Eventually, as big an impact as the tax cut.
As big as impact as the tax cut. So that's got a big tick from Chris Richardson. It was recommended by the Productivity Commission. So that one gets a tick. But on those tax cuts, I guess the difficulty here is balancing something that's not going to be inflationary, send inflation up again. This is built in, well, it doesn't start until mid-next year, and then the next bit comes mid-2027. Is there any danger here to inflation, and would a bigger tax package have a bigger risk to inflation?
Yes, but not big, partly because of the timing.
Right? You know,
we are talking about the government's measure is $5 per person per week in over a year from now. You would hope that by the middle of 2026 we have a better grip on inflation and that we are ahead of it. So no, you know, I don't think it's great policy, but I don't think it's dangerous in terms of inflation.
Let's look at what Chris Richardson likes to call the table of truth in the budget. It's one of the first things, Aruna, that we all go to. This is, I guess, getting away from some of the spin and telling us what the reality is about the money that's coming in to the budget, not necessarily because of government decisions, but also the money being spent that are because of government decisions. What does the table tell us about the state of the books?
So what the table tells us is that while the overall deficit that we're seeing hasn't moved very much, improved slightly, where that's come from is not through policy measures that have raised money to pay for the new spending. Rather, it's come from a source that's become a bit common, changes in the forecasts. So we've seen, what we can see in that table is that revenues have been forecast upwards by about $8 billion over the forward estimate period, the 4 years. But in particular this time, what we've seen is the spending forecast has come down by about $28 billion. And so that gives you a little over $36 billion. That is what the government's used and what the Treasurer's used to pay, basically they've split it roughly, to pay for two things, a big emphasis on primary care and aged care on the one hand, and then on the other hand, these tax cuts, which, you know, unfortunately, the easy part. I think a lot of people will welcome this type of reduction in personal income tax in Australia. We lean heavily on personal income tax in Australia relative to other countries similar to us. But what we don't have is the hard bit, which is how we raise tax that's sufficient to pay for the spending that we want and that we know is going to happen over the coming years.
Should we be worried about this return to deficit after a couple of surplus years back in deficit, and as far as the eye can see, as he said, for the next decade we remain in this structural deficit?
We have had a lot of luck as a nation. The tax take has been much bigger than expected, but not because of the decisions of the politicians. Basically, we had war, inflation, migration, all things that added to the tax take. The risk is that for a quarter of a century we haven't made our spending better, we haven't made our taxes, but tobacco tax, all sorts of terrible, dumb things. I doubt that we are match fit for an increasingly volatile world with a range of Trump-shaped risks on the rise.
I want to come to that. You mentioned one of the dumb things, in your words, Chris, tobacco excise. Look, it's been steadily increased at the rate at which it applies, but what impact has that had, and where has that left the budget?
It's an epic fail, right? You know, we have massively increased the tax per cigarette. It's about $1.40 per cigarette, but the amount collected went way down rather than way up.
Why is that?
Because of the black market. We begged, we increased the tax. We didn't improve the enforcement, and that gap was absolute catnip for criminals. Basically, we subsidised the rise of a black market for organised crime in Australia, more lucrative than heroin, but not with the same dangers. If you get caught, you get a fine, not jail. So we've seen the rise of crime that we basically did with this dumb tax. We've made health worse by making smoking much cheaper than before, and blown what I would estimate to be a tax hole of over $10 billion a year. There could be a dumber trifecta, but I don't know what it would be.
Well, they have announced tonight, the government, further measures on enforcement to try and shut that down. But, Chris, you don't think that's going to have a big... The horse is bolted now, is that your concern?
The horse is bolted. It's going to be really hard to convince those Australians who can go into a pub and buy their cigarettes for 10 or 12 bucks to go back to something that's much more expensive.
And Aruna, we did hear in the budget throughout the speech tonight, it's certainly there in the budget documents very clearly, Donald Trump not mentioned by name, but the tariffs certainly are. We don't know what's coming next week with this next round of tariffs. How much concern is there in this budget about it?
Look, it's clearly there both in the budget and outside the budget. I think it is very live. The first round effects of the tariffs aren't the main thing to worry about. That will be annoying and unwelcome and probably, you know, some bad economic policy. But the effects on the global economy and then the effects in terms of uncertainty and just the chaos and what effect that has on people's investment decisions, those are the things we need to be really worried about. And then even more worrying is the international rules-based order, which can, you know, if that breaks down, that starts to become, well, more troubling than expensive.
Yes, and more troubling than just what it means for our budget. But how much concern is there, do you think, Chris, within Treasury and more broadly amongst economists about the impact that Trump's tariffs are going to have?
Chaos comes at a cost. It's not just the tariffs, it's, you know, to understand US tariff policy, you have to be singing the hokey pokey at the same time. You put the tariff on, you take the tariff off, and you shake it about, right? And that chaos is hurting confidence, hurting economies, and to Aruna's point, the geopolitical question, you know, a more dangerous world, a more fractured world will, I suspect, eventually be a more expensive world for this budget as well.
Chris Richardson and Aruna Sathanapalli, thank you for joining us throughout the day and for your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to get some further reaction to tonight's budget from key members of the crossbench, starting now with Greens leader Adam Bandt, who joins me. Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us. Let's start on the tax cuts that have just been announced in this budget. $17 billion they will flow to all taxpayers. It's not a huge amount, though. They'll amount to, I think it's about $10 a week once they're fully implemented. We heard the coalition say earlier they won't support them. What about the Greens?
Look, the Greens won't stand in the way of those measures, but this tiny tax tweak budget really is a missed opportunity to deliver real cost of living relief, like getting dental into Medicare. An extra 73 cents a day in 15 months' time isn't going to help that much when your rent has already gone up hundreds of dollars. And meanwhile, there continues to be over $50 billion in the budget for subsidies for fossil fuel industries, over $100 billion in subsidies for wealthy property investors. Like billionaires and big corporations continue to get handouts and support now, and everyday people are being asked to wait. And I heard the talk on your panel before about what to do about revenue. Well, under this budget, 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax. Now, if we made those big corporations start paying their fair share of tax, we could fund things like dental into Medicare and give people relief now because people need it now.
OK, but on these tax cuts, you said you won't stand in the way. Does that mean you won't try to amend them? At the moment, these are going to apply to the wealthiest of Australians. Does that concern you at all?
Look, if the government bowls this up as standalone legislation and isn't up for conversations about bringing it forward, then yes, we'll support it. But as I say, like really what is clear from this budget, where 1 in 3 big corporations continues to pay no tax, where the government didn't take up the Greens' offer to legislate and Dutton-proof measures to be able to see the GP for free and wipe student debt now, is that Labor this week has put, together with the Liberals, they've put corporations before the community. The big corporations continue to laugh all the way to the bank, with 1 in 3 of them paying no tax, and everyday people are being asked to wait. It's clear from this that with the coming election, we've got to keep Peter Dutton out. And the only way to get Labor to act, though, is having more Greens there to make these big corporations pay their fair share of tax to fund things like dental into Medicare.
So just quickly and finally, Adam Bandt, if we do see this election produce a hung parliament, are these more ambitious reforms you're talking about, particularly cracking down on the corporates? Is that something that you will be demanding?
Look, I think this coming election is the best chance in a generation to get the big corporations to pay their fair share of tax and fund things like dental into Medicare, mental health into Medicare, wiping student debt, ensuring that education is genuinely free in this country. These are the kind of real cost of living relief measures that, yes, we will be putting on the table in that minority parliament. Keep Peter Dutton out and get Labor to act on real cost of living relief.
Greens leader Adam Bandt, thank you.
Thanks, David.
Let's go now to the independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, joining us this evening. Thanks for your time. You have been one of the more active proponents of genuine tax reform in this parliament. Is this the sort of tax reform you were hoping to see?
Look, I wouldn't describe this as tax reform. I would describe this as a tax cut. And look, I want to see a reduction on our reliance on personal income taxes, but we have a long way to go to make this tax system really work for young people, for productivity, for businesses, as well as the climate transition.
We've heard from the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, this evening. The Coalition won't support these. He has left open the option of going to the election with a bigger tax package. Would you be encouraging or supportive of the Coalition doing something bigger on the tax front?
Look, I'd love to see broader reform. I know that we have an increasing reliance on income taxes and, to be fair to the Treasurer, this does partly address it, but nowhere near enough. And we have a broader issue that I think really comes out in terms of also for businesses, where our businesses are struggling to invest, they're struggling to innovate, and we really need to be investing in that area too. So, I welcome any tax reform that the major parties will work with, and I hope very much to work with them on these sorts of issues in the next parliament if I'm re-elected.
I mean, tax reform broadly sounds positive, and cutting taxes is the easy part of that. The harder part is how do you pay for it? What's the part of reform where we raise the revenue to do these things, to lower those income taxes on working age Australians? Where would you be willing to look?
Look, I think, I've put everything out there on a tax green paper, and I say we do need to have all options on the table. But the reform I'm talking about also goes broader than just tax reform. There wasn't in this budget, I think, really enough in terms of driving productivity for our businesses. And I think this is where, we need to have EPBC reform that works for business as well as for the environment. We do need IR reform, and we need further reform in the construction sector, to make it cheaper and quicker to build construction. So there were some measures in there in the budget, but I think these are other areas of reform that we need to go much, much further in.
What about gas in our energy system? The Coalition's flagging they'll have something more to say before the election about trying to get more gas into the energy market. Climate change, big issue of your focus in politics. Would you welcome more gas moves to get more gas into the market?
Look, I think what we need to look at is transition for the next 10 years in particular, and work out how to do this in a way that is most reliable but is also cheapest for our consumers, and at the same time starts to address our climate goals. So at the moment, gas plays a pretty small part in our electricity system. It's actually decreased significantly last few years. It's only about 5% of the electricity system. And so any sort of system which is relying more on gas, I'd be saying, well, what's the cost going to be? What's going to be the climate impact? And how is this going to make sure that is going to deliver both for reliability but also for making sure that we can deliver our climate goals as well, and cost.
OK, Allegra Spender, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much, David.
And finally, in our speed dating session with some of the crossbenchers, let's go to the Tasmanian Senator Jackie Lambie from the Jackie Lambie Network. Good to talk to you. What do you make of this budget and the tax cuts that have been announced?
Well, we already heard all the tax cuts, mate. Of the tax cuts, there is none, really. There's nothing to brag about here. And giving rich people more tax cuts is not a viable option. I don't know how many times we need to tell them. Any cuts that you are giving to us, if you're not means testing, whatever, can you imagine those billions of dollars that you've wasted on giving it to people like me? And there are millions of us out there that have got more than enough money, instead of putting that forward to those people who need that more. This is just disgusting. It is lazy, and quite frankly, I want all those rich people to know if you are taking that payment, that energy payment, you are now a welfare recipient. So put that on your resume tonight. Small business. When I come in here and these people said here, these people at Labor is not a friend of small business, I never imagined they're not a friend of small business, they are the enemy. Up here this week, Spearsy, we are talking about dirty, stinking salmon sitting in Macquarie Harbour, and yet that tax write-off for small businesses finishes on the 1st of July. Wouldn't you think we'd have been sitting up here this week, Spearsy, doing something for small business and making sure they received that $20,000 write-off going from the 1st of July? Small business has been absolutely killed in the last 3 years. And why they're telling me, Spearsy, I just want to make sure this is quite clear, that in the budget papers here that we had, that they were creating 25,000 businesses a month in 23-24. I want them to know that's about 300, and in the meantime we had 360,000 businesses go under. Small business, so that's where we're at. So it's really shocking.
I want to just pick up on one thing, and I was going to ask you about this, and you brought it up there, the salmon. This is an issue that the government's going to try to legislate here in Parliament this week before the election to protect the salmon industry in Tasmania from challenge under the EPBC Act. You've referred to them as those stinking fish. Just give us an insight into the politics there in Tasmania on this. Do you think the government is backing the wrong side in its support for the salmon industry?
Both the major parties have not backed the right sides when it comes to the AFL stadium that they want built and want to generate money into, wasting taxpayers' money, and salmon farming. So they're on the wrong side. There are 65% of Tasmanians that do not want salmon farming going on in Tasmania. They want it pushed out into those coastal waters much further or doing it on land. It's not a lot to ask for multinationals that have been down there 3 years. They've paid no tax, and in the meantime, your taxpayers' money is spending $37 million, because we don't have a problem in Macquarie Harbour. Listen to this, apparently, according to the PM, we don't have a problem, but we're spending $37 million of your money over the next 12 months to put oxygen into it. And we're not making those multinationals pay for their crimes and the dirt and filth they've left in that harbour. That's where we're at today in Tasmania.
Senator Jackie Lambie, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, well, let's bring in our panel, my ABC colleagues, Laura Tingle, Jacob Grieber and Patricia Carvelis. Very good evening to all of you. It's always fascinating to hear the crossbench take on some of these measures, and we got a good taste of it there. It seems, though, the strongest opposition to the tax cuts so far, Laura, is not from the crossbench. Jackie Lambert, however, thinks it should be means-tested, that it shouldn't go to the top end. But Angus Taylor has tonight said these are a hoax, they're not going to support them. That surprised me, given in recent weeks we've seen the Liberals very quick to back in spending on all sorts of health measures, the energy bill rebate and so on, but not this one. Why not?
Well, I think it's really interesting, David. His statement, his initial statement said we're not going to back them, and just now in his interview with Sarah Ferguson, she said, so just to be clear, you're not offering personal income tax as part of the election. And he said, that's not what I said. I said we will not be supporting the Labor one. So this has raised expectations that after the long silence of crickets that we've had for months and months and months, it may be that the coalition is going to offer something quite radical as early as Thursday night. They might not be bigger cuts, but it may be. I mean, I noticed that Peter Dutton was talking about it's the biggest policy since Fight Back a couple of weeks ago. Maybe he's going to do a late-minute Fight Back.
We'll see, and we'll find that out on Thursday night, presumably, in the budget reply. But looking at the budget tonight, Jacob, this is a $17 billion decision here to put this money into, what are, the government admits, modest tax cuts, top-up tax cuts. Why have they decided to go in that direction instead of money for just the lower end of income earners or those on job seeker, or indeed money for defence, as many have argued? Why these across-the-board tax cuts?
Oh, it's an election. They did make a decision. They had a choice. They could have, as you said, brought back the Lamito. They could have.
That's the low and middle income tax.
Thank you for that.
For those who don't play acronyms.
My favourite acronym. They could have done that. They could have, found a way to distribute it much more at middle income earners, but they've gone across the board, and I think that's calculated, because the fight in this election, we're told, will be in the suburbs, in those mortgage belts where incomes are higher. There are dual incomes, a lot of women working part-time jobs, those tax cuts go across the board, and I think that's what they decided. It's also it's just a simpler thing to deliver.
Yeah, and look, we should also point out, PK, that there's only a tiny bit left in what's called decisions taken but not yet announced, bit over $1 billion, which means, you know, there won't be much more in the election campaign that's going to cost the budget. This is it. This is the big shot.
This is absolutely the big shot. Look, this is a pretty significant announcement from the Treasurer. I think they deliberately made sure that our expectations were at like below the floor, so low, so that they could go, surprise. I do think, though, that we are looking increasingly, based on what Angus Taylor, I think it's very significant what Angus Taylor sort of gave away in that interview. I reckon we're going to have a fight on alternative tax policies, it looks to me. I mean, we don't know what the coalition tax policy is yet, but he's not opposed to personal income tax cuts. He's been quite specific that they're looking to clearly do something else. And this comes on the back today. There was a moment in the party room where Peter Dutton said, stop the leaking. There has been increased pressure on the coalition from its own backbench to deliver a stronger economic narrative, to get on these issues. So there is now genuinely a fight on tax, not tax reform, but here's the thing. Tax cuts.
Can we afford these tax cuts, $17 billion as the budget goes into the red, into deficit? Can we afford even bigger tax cuts if that is what's coming later this week from the coalition? I mean, the public service cuts would not cover a cost of that, would it, Laura?
Look, I think we had some people on 7:30, some economists last night talking about this, making the point that really when you're trying to get the budget back into surplus now, it's not enough to just say we're going to cut spending. We do have to lift the overall tax take. Now, I don't think either side's going to be talking about that in this election. Can we afford them? I think politically, you know, if you look at the way the budget is constructed, the economy is forecast to lift enough to basically cover the cost of the spending commitments in it. So you could say in this particular budget, it's covered its cost, but the big issue is what we do about tax in the future. Now, I think none of us would have been expecting that the brawl in the election this time around was going to be about the size of tax cuts. So it's going to be really interesting to see just, you know, has Angus Taylor misspoke? You know, we start to wonder sometimes about the coalition, but the idea that we're going to get some debate about the nature of tax, personal income tax scales is quite interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is. Looking at that bottom line, Jacob, what do you make of how it looks, where the spending pressures are and where they're rising?
Well, I was just going to say on that question of how far the coalition can go with its own version of tax cuts. I mean, we'll see. Maybe this was just, you know, a random way he worded it, and maybe there's a deeper strategy there as well. But they're kind of constrained here. The budget envelope is not that large. No. Remember too that the coalition's much more likely to make a virtue of leaning into increased defence spending. It will be a big part of their pitch to voters. They're taking, you know, these geopolitical issues seriously. That comes with some huge dollar bills. I mean, we've got all the hawks out there telling us, the sort of foreign policy hawks telling us we need to get to 3% of GDP. So that's real money. And that then can't be available for tax cuts unless you want to blow the budget out in some other way.
I mean, that sort of 3% figure would be a huge leap. That's tens of $billions a year. That's not going to happen any time soon, you wouldn't think, under either side. But whatever they do is going to potentially cost more. You've got nuclear power, you've got, you know, other things that they want to do. But looking at the spending figures we see tonight, the deficit figures we see tonight, PK, the Treasurer is at pains to compare to the pre-election figures and forecasts that they inherited and say, look, they are better than those figures we inherited, the forecasts we inherited, fine, but they're worse than how the budget looked 12 months ago. We've gone from surplus into deficit. There's no denying that.
They are absolutely worse, and I don't think the timing of the election has been helpful because we've had a kind of spending spree over the last couple of months. Now, individually, if you look at all of the items that they've committed money to, they're hard to argue with, right? Like boosting bulk billing, looking at cheaper medicines, energy bill relief. Like, people are really struggling. So they all kind of make sense individually, but when you put them cumulatively together, it's a pretty significant, steep increase in spending. And there is no sort of structural answer to it. I can't see a structural answer from the coalition either, can I say. They've backed in all of this spending. They haven't backed in the tax cuts, which we were all surprised about because, you know, they are the party that says they will always be lower taxing. And so, you know, it leads you to the conclusion that if you're going to argue that, you kind of have to prove that at some point. But I think the budget, I don't think anyone's really dealing with the structural issues that Laura's just pointed out in terms of the budget.
There's more in this. Yeah, there's more in this budget that I want to come to with all of you, including on the migration figures, which you touched on in your piece tonight, Laura. But also, you know, Donald Trump, he who must not be named in the budget papers, but certainly what he's doing on tariffs is a big concern for the government and for Treasury as well. Right now, though, as the government is hoping the tax cuts announced tonight will grab the attention of households, what's in it for Australian businesses? The ABC's business reporter, Nassim Kadem, takes a look.
Labor's fourth budget was delivered at a time of heightened uncertainty, ongoing volatility, subdued growth. Trump's trade wars, a slowdown in China and continuing conflicts in Europe and the Middle East risk disrupting economic growth and pushing up prices. But for now, the budget papers show the economy is expected to grow as domestic inflation slows, and that likely means more interest rate cuts this year. More people are expected to hold on to their jobs, and promised tax cuts for households will line people's pockets with the hope they'll spend them. Treasury says that will in turn boost the bottom line of businesses and the economy. There's measures to help workers. 1 in 5 are subject to what's known as a non-compete clause that restricts their ability to move to a new job. The government will ban these for low and middle income workers. That will allow them to move into higher paying roles or start their own business, boosting economic growth. There's also measures for small business. About 1 million will get $150 off their electricity bills. The government's also increasing funding for the consumer watchdog to crack down on bad behaviour in the supermarket and retail sector and to make it easier for fresh food suppliers to enforce their rights. The ACCC will also be given more funding to better protect franchisees. There's also $20 million for a campaign to encourage consumers to buy Australian-made products and funding to support green metals production and help increase private investment in green technology. To have enough skilled workers to try and meet an ambitious target of building 1.2 million homes, apprentices in housing construction will get up to $10,000 in financial incentives. The Treasurer says the nation remains on target for an economic soft landing, but events overseas still risk pulling the rug out from under Australia.
Events overseas indeed. We're back with Laura Tingle, Jacob Grieber and Patricia Karvelas. Let's talk about some of those events overseas. Big concern for business, big concern for Treasury as well. They don't mention Donald Trump by name, as I say, but to quote from the Treasury paper, the budget papers, the use of tariffs by major trading partners could lead to higher import prices and temporarily higher inflation and lower growth. Jacob, to you first on this one. How concerned do you think Treasury is about this?
They're thinking a lot about this. It's not as straightforward as you'd think, and you just read out that line. So there are worries that tariffs will make inflation worse, and that's very true. When you raise taxes, which is what a tariff is, you create a higher cost that consumers bear. That will be a story in the United States, but it can flow over into our economy and cause our prices to be higher. The tricky bit for Treasury is the way they're thinking about it is this could be so damaging and scary to the economy, and economies all over the world for that matter, that it ends up hurting those economies. Businesses retract their spending, consumers park their spending, and you end up getting an economic downturn that perversely eases inflation pressures.
Yeah, Laura, I mean, who knows what's going to come next week with the next round of Trump tariffs. There's some speculation that he'll maybe not reverse course, but certainly narrow down because of the plunge in the stock market and the concerns about how this will flow through to the American consumer and then the opinion polls as well, no doubt. But we don't know. The government doesn't know what's coming. I guess all we can look at is, are we putting the Australian budget in the best shape possible to weather what's coming?
Well, I think the government's argument here is, there is that uncertainty. I mean, I suppose the thing that struck me about the budget papers tonight, apart from the lack of light on it, is that it's much more...
It's the tariff cuts have started early. Yeah.
Coming in early.
We started talking about it and the lights go out.
Yeah, but I think the general tone of the economic forecasts is actually, I mean, it's not, happy days, hurrah, hurrah, but that sort of sense of, we're right on the edge of, oh my God, we might get a recession this year. That's all gone, and that's been there for 2 or 3 years. So that's gone. The Treasury and the government do seem really convinced that the economy has turned the corner. Now, so what has the government done in an economic strategy sense? Well, the tax cuts are actually now going to help consumption. We're at a point in time where we're seeing the private sector forecast to overtake the public sector as the driver of growth. Inflation's down, so we can afford, apparently, to have more spending out there in the economy, so that should boost it. As Jacob says, the concern seems to be more about growth necessarily now than inflation. So if that's the case, there's a rationale there that these tax cuts, which of course don't come in until into next year, could actually help prop things up if it's starting to get a little bit soft because of this uncertainty.
Yeah, and the fact that they have been delayed to next year and that there's 2 phases really of the, what is it called, the top-up. I do like the language of the top-up. It also really makes it easier for the Reserve Bank, doesn't it? That it is also in the next week actually, and then throughout the year obviously going to be looking at further interest rate cuts, people hope, and certainly the government hopes for its own political fortunes, but I think people who have mortgages also hope.
And the budget has, I think, 2 interest rate cuts banked into its assumptions. It's a market forecast, but they're assuming that will happen.
Another 50 basis points by the end of the year.
You would think that the Reserve Bank would not see this and the way that these extra tax cuts have been built in as inflationary. So, some people will push to say, right, so, that they should have gone further and faster and earlier because people are feeling the pain now, but they still have dealt with that ongoing issue. Yeah, we've turned the corner, but inflation isn't entirely a finished story. And so I think there is a sense of responsibility in the way they've built that I think that is worthy of mentioning and giving them some credit for.
Yep. And I think on that too, they kind of take effect when the energy rebates finish. So the new energy rebates that are coming in go through next year. When they come off and cease to be effective
at the end of this year,
these
tax cuts would
kind of start at that time. So there's a bit of sequencing going on here as well.
Look, migration, we know it's been a hot political topic at times during this parliamentary term. We know Peter Dutton is also in this election campaign promising to detail exactly what he wants to do to bring those numbers down. What do tonight's budget figures tell us about the migration outlook, Laura?
David, the budget showed the forecast for net overseas migration, which is effectively the total migration figure each year, going to 225,000 people a year by 27-28 and then 28-29. Now, last week we got some figures for the year to September, which were 380,000. Now, that's going to be a big leap down to get to that, even though it's a couple of years away, because, as we've already seen, the numbers are higher at the moment, partly because you're seeing a lot of people arriving and they're not leaving as they're expected to do. So, one, it sort of creates an issue about how realistic that number is. And it's interesting that Treasury notes in the budget papers that 225,000 doesn't take into account the 380,000 figure. It didn't update for that number. But it also, I think, crystallises the difficulty for the coalition, which has definitely said it wants to have the permanent number drop to 140 and may or may not, depending on which day of the week they're talking about it, want to also drop net overseas migration to 160,000 compared to the 225,000 forecast.
Well, it's going to be an interesting few days ahead with a budget reply, maybe an alternative tax approach being unveiled, and then an election possibly being called within days as well. Plenty to come. Great to talk to all of you.
It was an intense question time. I came into budget up late, and let me tell you, you can feel there's just that you can cut the air. It's so intense.
Everybody's ready to go. Thank you all very much for that this evening. Well, tonight's tax cuts and the energy bill relief clearly aimed at helping families who are struggling to make ends meet. Ahead of the details being announced, Triple J Hack's Shalila Medora met one such family in Adelaide.
Every day, Tanana Langi has to wake up her 2 young kids at 5 a.m.
It's the only hour I see them for the day, so it's get up, get breakfast, get everybody out of the house, clothes, the chaos of the morning.
It takes Tanana 90 minutes to get from her home in Adelaide's outer suburbs to her work in the inner city. On the way, she has to drop her 3-year-old to childcare and her 6-year-old to school. The long hours are taking their toll.
We're all really burnt out, and you can see the immense pressure it has on my family every day, each of us, from top to bottom.
Tanana desperately wants more time with her kids, but her family is in survival mode.
Every month we need 2 full-time incomes, so that's my husband and I doing 80 hours per week.
Even then, they're only just making ends meet.
Our family's having to work harder just to tread water. We're not really advancing at all, even though we're working 10 times more than we were 5 years ago.
Grocery and petrol costs eat up a lot of that pay.
About 5 years ago, $300 worth of groceries was pretty fancy. We were spending, that's like getting everything organic. We're getting nappies, we're getting everything else. And now $300 groceries is like lentils and pasta.
With little relief in sight.
The interest rate drop has felt like it didn't happen.
As the federal election inches closer, Tanana wants the next government to offer a circuit breaker for families like hers.
Rather than hemorrhaging billions of dollars into our childcare industry, which is for profit, what's a more holistic approach to support families?
Over the last 3 years, the Albanese government has increased the childcare subsidy and passed legislation to remove the activity test for 3 days of subsidised childcare per week. Tanana says she'd love to have the option of working less to spend more time with her kids.
My kids would be coming home at 3 o'clock and I'd be cooking quality food rather than being forced into rushed meals and unhealthy decisions, and we'd be spending more time together as a family. Right now, we barely get a day.
Well, Shalila Medora joins me now for more on this. Shalila, how do you think the family you spoke to there would react to tonight's surprise tax cut?
Yeah, look, the Langis are a 2-income family. They're average income earners or median income earners. So under the Treasury modelling, they'd be expected to receive about $8,500 in combined tax cuts, including the ones that were introduced today. They also have 2 dependent children, so that affects things like the Medicare levy, for example. They're eligible, like everyone, to those energy bill relief that's been extended to the end of the year, and also to cheaper medicines on the PBS if they require those. But as I mentioned in that story there, Tanana's family says that groceries and petrol are 2 of her biggest costs aside from the mortgage, and there's nothing really in the budget to address those big concerns for her.
Yeah, and what about young Australians? I mean, you're talking to them, hearing from them all the time through Triple J. How are they going to be feeling after tonight's budget, do you think?
Yeah, look, so the number one thing that young people tell us, and they've told the ABC many times, is their top concern right now is housing. But if you were to look at this budget just as a standalone document, you wouldn't necessarily get that sense from this document. There are no new measures that are listed in this when it comes to housing. There's an expansion of the joint equity help to buy scheme, which means that singles now earning up to $100,000 and couples earning up to $160,000 will now be eligible to take part in the scheme. And they've also increased the caps when it comes to the value or the cost of those homes as well. There is a 2-year freeze on foreign nationals buying existing properties, but there are a raft of exemptions to that as well. The other thing that we know that has been positively received by young people are existing measures that have been announced in relation to cutting their student loans. So that is the 20% cut in the overall value of their loan. That was announced if the Labor Party is returned to office, and also changes to indexation on how that indexation is applied. Both of those things have been very welcomed by young people.
Interesting. Shalala Medora, thank you very much for that this evening. Well, for more reaction to the budget, I'm joined now by Bram Black from the Business Council of Australia and Cassandra Goldie from the Australian Council of Social Services. Thank you both very much for joining me after your own budget lock-up today. Cass, we know you sit on the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, which, again, I think it's 3 years in a row you've called for job seeker increase to be a top priority. There hasn't been a further increase for job seeker tonight. This tax cut instead that goes to all taxpayers. What do you make of that?
We're astounded, David, that the centrepiece of tonight's budget is more dollars for everybody except people with the least. With this recommendation from this expert committee chaired by Jenny Macklin, which has consistently said the top priority, if you're worried about people who are financially disadvantaged in a cost of living crisis, is to fix the adequacy of job seeker. Now, on their recommendations, that would have cost us about, $4.6 billion to fix it properly, and then we would have been able to move beyond the reality that those people just do not have enough money. $56 a day, David. I cannot believe that again tonight. We've been able to afford another $7 billion in a round of tax cuts off the back of $20 billion that was spent last year in tax cuts. Remember, tax cuts go right up the income scale, so wealthy people get the benefit of a tax cut, and people with the least tonight are still waiting.
What do you think, Bram Black? Is this $17 billion tax cut the best way to spend that money?
Well, we are supportive of the tax cut. We think that it's $17 billion over 5 years. We know that everybody's doing it tough. We've seen that there are measures that are intended to support people right across the board, including the tax cuts, including what we've seen in terms of relief with respect to electricity bills, of course in terms of medicines as well. But fundamentally, we're concerned that this budget doesn't contain a sufficiently clear agenda for how we can grow the size of the pie. Ultimately, if we can invest in productivity-enhancing measures, that's how we gain the scope to make further investments.
What should they include?
Well, there are a few key things that we've called for. I mean, broadly speaking, we want to see changes with respect to industrial relations, with respect to how we do approvals processes and so forth. But, some specific measures that I'd call out would include a broad-based investment allowance. 20% is what we've called for. We've called for a new approach to how we do research and development in terms of the tax incentive and how that applies. And we think we've got to be really targeted on how we can reform the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act to deliver both outcomes for business on the one hand, but also outcomes for the environment as well.
What about the measure tonight on banning non-compete clauses for low and middle income earners? That is seen as a productivity enhancing measure. Do you welcome that?
No, it's not something that we support.
Why not?
There are a few key reasons, but the first and most critical for me is that there is already a significant body of case law that tells you what you can and can't do. So we think that this is a good situation in which you apply a regulation, an education, rather than a regulation approach. And what that means in practice is that people should have a clear understanding, government-provided information that goes to what they can expect and what they can and can't do if they're an employee, but also what they can and can't do if they're an employer.
But why do you think hairdressers should be hit with non-compete clauses?
Well, think about it from the perspective of somebody who's operated a small business as a hairdresser. They might have run a store on a suburban shopping centre for 20 years. They've invested each and every year in their staff with training, with resourcing, with new techniques and so forth. And then one of their staff opens up a store just down the road.
It's competition, isn't it?
It is competition, but it's not an incentive for small businesses particularly to invest in their staff if they know that they can walk out the door with that critical information.
Coming back to your concerns, Cass, around those who are the most vulnerable, sure, they may not get the tax cut if they aren't a taxpayer. Government would, I'm sure, argue they will get energy bill relief, the bulk billing incentives that are extended. There are other measures here tonight for them. Do you accept?
Well, people on very low incomes, job seeker, they are taxpayers, David. They pay the GST. That's the first thing.
True.
But they won't get the benefit from an income tax cut. again. The energy bill relief, we've never been a fan of it. It goes to everybody. You know, by now we've spent $6.8 billion on that measure. And this one, now it does end in December. And for people on low incomes out there who are struggling, you know, 14 times more likely to be going without one substantial meal a day, unable to keep the lights on. It's very serious, this financial crisis that people on very low incomes are in. This is one off, this energy bill relief. It will, whereas the tax cuts, they go on. So I want to highlight tonight, there are some really important measures in this budget, no question. You know, the investment in public education, we celebrate that. 80% of children from low-income families are in public schools. You know, creating more bulk billing, fantastic. These are really important priorities. 3 days of early childhood education, great. But to continue to refuse to deal with the top priority in terms of tackling poverty in a very wealthy country, as I say, tonight, again, we go, when will it be done if you can find more room for tax cuts and not room to help people who really need the help the most?
Does the Business Council support an increase in JobSeeker?
What we would like to see is more reform, as I've said, that grows the size of the pie so that we're in a position to take those types of steps.
But do you support an increase in JobSeeker?
Well, we would like to see that, as I say, but I think what we need to get to is a point where we're not, as we are right now, looking down the barrel of year after year after year of deficit. That makes it particularly challenging.
The committee, this expert committee, looked at the benefits of increasing JobSeeker beyond, of course, the really important benefits to somebody who's trying to feed themselves and deal with suicidal ideation because they're so destitute. And it's very clear it is a productivity measure. In fact, you know, you'll get another 25% back from the investment you make because people are less distressed. They're more able to invest in skills development to rework how they're going to get back into the labour market, because we desperately need people in the labour market to take up, good jobs. But you cannot do that when you're in such financial distress.
Just one more question before I let you go, because this is something that's being talked about as we head into the election campaign, Brand Black. Does the Business Council want the safeguards mechanism for the 200 heaviest emitters in Australia relaxed at all, or are you happy to see that stay as it is?
Look, our members are comfortable with the safeguard mechanism. Indeed, they proposed changes to the safeguard mechanism that have been incorporated into the existing mechanism. So we think that the critical thing that we should be looking for as a nation is clarity on what the plan is that helps us deliver on net zero. There are a series of initiatives, there are different proposals coming from different sides of politics. Fundamentally, business is looking for certainty so it can make investments.
All right, well, thank you both very much for joining us on Budget Night. We look forward to hearing from you through the campaign as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, it wouldn't be Insiders without talking pictures, and for cartoonists and photographers, Budget Day is one of the busiest days of the year. Mike Bowers spent the day tracking the Australian Financial Review's legendary cartoonist David Rowe. From idea to work of art in a matter of hours, here's how he does it.
Here in Canberra, the budget tree is still green with just a little teeny hint of autumnal colours right at the top. And yet, here we are in the lockup for a budget no one expected. A budget that essentially blew our way because of tropical cyclone Alfred. Also blown into town this week is David Rowe, cartoonist for the Australian Financial Review. The shadow of this election hangs over this budget, so let's go and see what he's got cooking up. Hey, David. Happy budget.
Mike, good on you. Good to see you again.
Obviously, the shadow of this election is cast all over this budget. What are the other elements that you're pulling into your front page?
Well, I think Trump might be featuring this year. Like, he's just such an omnipresent figure.
Yeah.
So that might be interesting. And yeah, I'm sort of tossing up with some background figures as well. So Angus Taylor and Alba.
We're deep into the lockup. Let's go and check with David, see how he's going. Are we on course, or are you going to have to change?
This year we're on course. I think we're okay. I've had a chat with Phil and Cozzy, and I'm getting away with getting a bit of Trump in the cartoon.
Come to check on the cartoon. Is it in here? I wish I had asked now.
The dragon's there, sort of semi-slayed.
I'll check in on the dragon.
Yeah, I know. Well, I thought I'd stick him in the background.
Yeah, I love it, mate.
Part of the theatre of Budget Day is the conference in the lockup, where the Finance Minister and the Treasurer address the entire assembled press gallery. And I'm talking with Lucas Kosh, who's photographer for AAP. Lucas, this is the second year running. I've spoken to you. Did you draw the short straw yet again?
Yes, here I am again. Yeah.
So is there a repetitiveness to it? Is it hard to keep it fresh? If it all goes to plan and you get a good shot, what does that look like?
Well, this budget is a bit special. It's a bit low energy, and I think it has two topics. You know, it's unwanted, and it's in a deficit.
So do you think they're keeping their powder dry for the election? They might be holding back some of the announcements that could have been in here so they can go da-da-da-da at the last week of the election?
Definitely. It feels like just a warm-up for the campaign.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what you get out of this, mate.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you.
It's smiling.
Okay, thanks.
So we're at the end of the lockup now, David.
Yeah.
Where have you landed on this? So we're in aisle 25.
Yeah, olive oil. I've added the dragon in there, clean up. And then you've got the cyclone.
Who gives you the key words?
It's everyone, basically. Like, that's the beauty of being in here on Budget Day, is you hear them all chattering away. So Stutch was in here today. I had a chat with him for my editorial about the cartoon, so like just getting the nuances right for the day, for the paper. The budget's, it's kind of fun.
Yeah. Well, the viewers have got a little sneak peek of what the Fin review is going to be tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thanks, mate. Good on you. Well, that's it from the 2025 budget. Back to you in the studio, David.
I thought I was supposed to do that.
You can do that. Back to you, David.
Oh, that's a first. Thank you, Treasurer. Thank you, Mike. And thank you for joining us tonight. It is going to be a big few days ahead here in Parliament House. The Prime Minister will be joining me on Sunday morning for Insiders. We may be in an election campaign by then, or he may be about to call it. Either way, hope you can join us then. Good night.
The government delivers modest tax cuts, protections for workers and extends some cost of living relief in its pre-election budget. We'll hear from corporate leaders on how it shifts the dial on the big issues like the housing crisis and Donald Trump's tariffs. And small businesses say they've been left behind. We have our expert panel in the studio. Independent economist Nikki Hutley, AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver, our very own Chief Business Correspondent Ian Verinder. Welcome to you all, and welcome to you. This is the Business Budget Special. I'm Kirsten Aiken. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has handed down his fourth budget and the nation's finances are back in the red. The deficit is slightly deeper than forecast in the mid-year economic update. While debt will initially be lower than previously expected, it is projected to accelerate over the forward estimates. In the short term, economic growth has been downgraded due to ex-tropical cyclone Alfred and a weaker global economy. We'll hear shortly from the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. But first, Nadia Daly takes a look at what's in the budget for business.
This cafe is among the 2.6 million small businesses that the government calls the lifeblood of Australia's towns and cities. Twin brothers and owners Ali and Ahmed say their business is being squeezed by power bills.
Last year's probably been up about 33%, and we're paying about almost $7,000 a quarter.
They say the budget's $150 energy rebate is welcome relief, but doesn't go far enough.
I mean, it's not going to take a dent out of that.
Down the road, manager Lily Tan hopes the new tax cuts will put more cash in the pockets of her customers, who are watching every dollar when it comes to non-essentials like perfume.
Do you have to just give more incentive for the parents or for the family? I think more tax cuts good.
The cuts will reduce the lowest tax bracket from 16% to 15% from July of 2026, and then 14% the following year, providing $268 of relief in the first year and $536 from the second year on. but it comes at a cost.
It's about $17.1 billion. So that's quite a lot of money. For an individual household, it's trivial. For the first year they operate, in 26-27, it's just $5 a week for an average person on average wages, and in the second year it's only $10 a week, so it won't even buy you a sandwich and a milkshake.
Shops selling local produce hope the government's $20 million Buy Australia campaign will boost their bottom line, though the budget was thin on detail on just how the money would be spent. There's more cash for the competition watchdog to regulate the franchising sector and supermarkets. Extra money for the corporate regulator ASIC to clamp down on phoenixing. Support for the hospitality sector, including a 2-year freeze on draft beer excise. A national licensing scheme for electricians to work across states and territories, which could be expanded to other trades and potentially lift GDP by $10 billion a year. With a further $5 billion boost hoped to come from banning non-compete clauses for workers earning less than $175,000 a year. Non-compete clauses are a drag on productivity in the economy. We know productivity is an issue. The budget forecasts are quite optimistic going forward on those. So, every little measure we see is good. Economists say while the energy rebates and other incentives are certainly welcome, they won't have a huge impact on consumers, businesses, or the economy as a whole.
I think there's a lot of talk in the budget for small business, but to be honest with you, I don't think that there's a lot in there which is really substantial.
A whiff of hope maybe, but businesses want more.
To be honest to you, $150 is not enough. Yeah, just is not enough to cover even 5% of the electricity bill. Yes, it's not.
In an economy that's been on the nose.
Well, we've just heard the initial reactions from our expert panellists who between them have more than 100 years experience covering federal budgets. Let's bring them in for more analysis now. Shane, you say the budget is more show than substance. Why?
Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons. The tax cuts are talked about a lot, but in the great scheme of things, they're trivial. The other aspect is that we're, again, relying on bracket creep. To get us back to balance in 10 years' time, we're relying on bracket creep. And, of course, that's still a key feature of the budget. Many of the measures are quite worthy, but in the great scheme of things, they're actually quite small. There's a lot of talk about expanding productivity, national competition policy and so on, but we don't really see a lot of work being done in that area to actually boost competition in, say, areas like the oligopolies we have in our supermarkets, airlines and so on. So, yes, there's stuff in there which is commendable, but in the great scheme of things, I don't really see a big impact on the economy.
In the Treasurer's own words, the income tax cuts, they're top-ups, they're modest. Why don't governments seem keen to index tax brackets to address bracket creep?
Well, you'd kill all the fun if you did that, because, I mean, bracket creep is the wonderment for a treasurer, because it has two great effects. The first is that, you can basically just sit back if you're in government for, say, 2 terms, for 6 years or so, you can sit back and do virtually nothing and see wages rise and see the tax income come in and swell, and that can end up solving your deficit problem. And the other great present for treasurers is that right before an election, you can come out and say, look at this evil bracket creep. We need to do something about this. I'll give you a tax cut. Then you do it all again the next time round.
OK, so that's what's happened this year? OK. Nikki, how do you view tonight's announcements and how many of the measures are substantive?
Yeah, well, I think Shane summed it up really well. There's a lot in there, and as with all budgets, you have to go through the fine-tooth comb and 2 weeks later you're still discovering the details. But none of it looked to me as though it was making a meaningful difference. We've got budget deficits. It's like, oh, don't worry about that, look somewhere else. And there was a big focus in the Treasurer's speech about how wonderful the economy was and we're back in good conditions, we've turned the corner together. But his rosy speech was not mirrored by the actual forecasts going forward. It's still a very tepid economy, getting up to 2.75% over the next 2.5 or so years. That's not strong growth by anybody's means, and it's relying on assumptions around productivity that we have yet to get anywhere near. So I think there's a lot of problems. There's some things that you could like in this, bits of initiatives around women's participation, for example, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not changing anything fundamentally. OK, we're going to get more thoughts from you shortly, but for now, let's hear from the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher.
Finance Minister, welcome. The government has announced income tax cuts should it win another term, but this isn't the type of structural tax reform economists wanted to see, is it?
Well, these are an important part of the budget that Jim Chalmers just handed down, some modest tax cuts, but ones that build upon the tax cuts that were handed down in a previous budget. And all in all, I think together with some of the cost of living measures that we've got in this budget, they will help households meeting some of those pressures right now. We always look to see what we can do on the tax front. We have to balance that up with a whole range of other competing pressures on the budget. But we think these are sensible, responsible, affordable, and they will make a difference once fully implemented.
But as it stands, even bracket creep won't see the budget return to balance in a decade. Does the government need to do more to raise new streams of revenue?
Well, we've made no secret of the fact that the budget's under pressure, and it has been since we came to government. Yeah, I mean, managing the budget, you've got to look at every which way to make sure you can deal with some of those pressures right now, make room for additional investments in the future, and make sure that the budget as a whole, maps out the way forward.
Inflation is forecast to rise slightly in 2026. Is that a sign that the government will stop subsidising household and small business energy bills at the end of this year?
Well, in terms of the Treasury forecast, it's actually an improvement from MyEFO, where it's saying that inflation will return and be comfortably within the band 6 months earlier than they had previously expected. So the inflation story is actually a positive one in this budget. But
inflation spikes when the subsidies end.
Well, the energy rebates are built into the inflation forecasts, and where you see there's some of those are rounding mechanisms that Treasury uses in their forecast, but they are saying that inflation is sustainably back into band 6 months earlier and it will stay there. On the energy bill rebates, the point that you raise, look, we are looking at how we taper that support. They're not an ongoing payment, which is why we've extended it for 6 months, just to help households through to the end of, I think it's to the end of 2025.
What is the government's longer-term plan to reduce energy costs? And will the government consider a gas reservation policy for the East Coast market during the transition to renewables?
Well, we've made no secret that gas is a firming fuel. We need it in the transition to renewables, which is why...
Do you need more of it?
Well, which is why we've put in the future gas strategy and why we've been working hard. And I think the information the regulator has provided is that supply is secure up to 2028, 29.
Are you ruling out a gas reservation policy?
Well, what I'm saying is we will always ensure that we have enough gas for the Australian needs. That's absolutely the case, and that we've put in place all of that work in this term of government. But in addition to that, the future, what does the future look like? It's all of the work we've done in the previous 3 budgets, what the work Chris Bowen's been doing in modernising the energy system, the grid, through rewiring the nation, but also all of the work that we're putting into making sure that there is a renewable energy future.
That said, is green hydrogen looking more and more like a pipe dream?
No, I don't think so, and we've had some measures that go into that. I mean, the role of government, and you can see this through our production tax credits, through the Hydrogen Head Start program, through the work...
$75 million allocated to hydrogen under that Hydrogen Head Start program wasn't spent and has been redirected within the climate portfolio. Green hydrogen just isn't working at the moment, is it?
Well, we're prepared to support these emerging industries. We want them. We want government. We believe government has a role to support that. But we also, and this is part of our approach to budgeting, where there are underspends or there is a more effective and a more immediate need for investment, we do expect ministers and their departments to reprioritise within existing appropriation. The budget isn't just a continue to add on scenario. We have, there has to be spending restraint, there has to be discipline, and we have to make sure that every dollar of taxpayers' funds is used in the most efficient and effective way. And you see that in the climate portfolio, but you see it in many others as well.
Katie Gallagher, thank you for joining the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's return to the panel. Nikki, is green hydrogen still a feasible strategy to underpin the renewables transition?
Look, it's not going to underpin renewables. It's always going to be something that's, very specific to certain industries. It's not the core part of our system. We've got solar, we've got wind, and that's what we need to get going with and need to roll out the transmission. It's very expensive for Australia. Anywhere in the world, even in places like China and India, they're still getting the costs right, and they've got much lower energy costs than we do. We hope we'll get there one day, but it's not a core part of the strategy. We're better off focusing on other industries. I mean, iron and aluminium, these things are green industries, are more prospective, but even those are still challenging and a long way off, so they need a bit of support if we're going to get there.
Ian, is it looking as though the government is going to have to go it alone in terms of green hydrogen, given that industry just doesn't look as keen as it was on this a year or so ago?
I think there's been a couple of fairly major people who've fallen over with green hydrogen, a couple of big corporations, one in the Hunter Valley, a couple of hydrogen hubs, so-called. They've all tended to back away from the project. I don't think the government is going to go down there on their own. They haven't committed any kind of funding for that. And there's been, I think, compared to last year, a very enthusiastic approach last year to this whole, Made in Australia project and to a lot of projects like green hydrogen and pursuing our own production of minerals and so forth. That seems to be much more muted this time around.
Yeah, there wasn't much allocated in this budget, and yet last year it was one of the government's signature policies.
It certainly was, but not this time. And I think you've got, you've had a change in the administration in America and a very different approach from America to partnerships around the world. And clearly we're seeing a much more antagonistic approach towards Australia from America at the moment.
Shane, it sounds as though the Labor government is firm on the end date for household and small business energy rebates. Is it going to have to consider a gas reservation policy for the East Coast to bring energy prices down?
To be honest with you, I think it probably will, and that is a key critique of the electricity rebates, that they're a lot of money, $1.8 billion just for 6 months. And that's not really achieving anything. We could be doing things to fundamentally bring down the price, making it easier to supply more gas, reserving more gas for Australia, and obviously looking at other technologies. But that is a big problem. And I think at the end of the day, we will have to have a gas reservation. And if the government wants to avoid households seeing big increases in their electricity bills beyond December, they might even have to extend the rebates for another 6 months, which I think would be a disaster. But we're digging ourselves into a hole here. We've got a massive gap at present between current electricity prices and the price that people are actually paying. And that's the thing that's really scaring the government. That's the problem with these sort of subsidies.
Nikki, you're a councillor on the Climate Council. Do you agree? Is a gas reservation policy looking inevitable?
Oh, I think it is. I mean, gas is for a long time going to be, that transition fuel that supports the renewable sector, both as part of the core system and for peaking. And so we can't afford to, and the economy is growing, we're using more energy, not less. Things like data centres are fuelling demand. So the idea that we can just bring our demand down and bring the overall energy requirements down is not realistic. So we're going to need some of it, and we know that it's getting shorter in supply. It's getting more and more expensive. I mean, obviously some of that's geopolitical, given what's happened with Ukraine. But even in the long term, if geopolitical considerations, hopefully get solved sooner rather than later, it's expensive, and we want to have the cheapest system that we can. We can see, just look at a chart of gas prices since we started the exports out of the country and, not limiting them, and that's just been disastrous for prices on the East Coast. And I can't believe the West Coast is about to follow suit.
Well, gas prices actually determine the cost of electricity. So if we brought down the price of gas, electricity here would be so much cheaper. And our exporters at the moment are draining the East Coast market, particularly of gas, so that there are shortages. And that is why gas prices are so high, and it's what drives electricity prices.
OK, thank you. Now we're going to go to Melbourne, where Daniel Ziffer is standing by with business leaders to hear their take.
Good evening. Let's talk about the impact on business. I have David McEwen, the CEO of the Simmons Group, a prolific builder of homes, and Lee Petchell, the Chief Financial Officer of the Port of Melbourne, our busiest port. Let's deal with housing first. In the past year or two, it's been described as a crisis. Have you seen much in this budget that you think is going to shift the dial?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's certainly been a lot announced pre-budget as well, but, you know, it is a crisis, as you say, and I think there are some really positive things about tonight's budget. But this is an election budget, as we know, so we're not going to see a lot of big structural reform coming through, but some of the things that have been announced have been helpful in the short term, whether it's around the expansion of the Help to Buy scheme, whether it's about, you know, increasing productivity by reducing red tape or getting more apprentices into the market, which is really positive. So I think there's some good things there, but, you know, there's a lot more work to be done, certainly in terms of the next 3 to 5 years in housing. And this budget, whilst making a good start, probably doesn't address all those key issues.
One of the things we discussed in the budget is the storm clouds, the potential impact of tariffs and a global trade war. Do you think that enough was done in this budget to deal with that future uncertainty that affects your business very much so?
Well, I guess, Dan, how do you deal with uncertainty? How do you plan for uncertainty? The Port of Melbourne, we see 1/3 of Australia's trade pass through every year. We're the biggest container port in Australia. And we'd say that the biggest thing is resilience and productivity. If you look at the economic statement, it does go to some of the things that would feed that. So the need for investment in infrastructure. As a private investor in infrastructure, the Port of Melbourne sees that ability to partner with government around investment is really important. It talks about the need for dwellings and investment in dwellings. Well, the Port of Melbourne is where most of the goods that are going to go inside those houses, whether it be furniture, appliances, fittings, toys, they're going to come in through the port, so we see that as important. And international trade and the need for us to continue to diversify and grow new trading partners or grow the existing ones we have. We've seen across the port over the last 5 years where we would have seen 30% of our exports going to China. That's now tempered to about 20%. And it's through the growth in those markets like Thailand, Vietnam. There was discussion about India in this plan, and Indonesia and Malaysia that has really driven that growth in other markets and alternative markets. So those things, together with growing productivity, which investment in infrastructure, both digital and physical assets, is set to deliver. So the private sector and its role in that's really important.
Both of you very affected by consumer sentiment, by the overall economy. What have you seen in this budget that might shift that in a positive way and make people more likely to make the big outlay, for example, buying a house?
Look, there's a lot in there that will help people in the short term. We are seeing still a lot of nervousness, though, and fear about inflation, fear what that means for interest rates. Does this budget resolve that? I think there's going to be some scrutiny over the coming days and weeks as to whether this is inflationary or helpful. I think there's going to still be a lot of nervousness and a lot of people waiting to see how this plays out. Affordability is still a massive challenge on housing. Short-term tax relief, short-term investments in very important areas like health and education are really important, but it doesn't make the cost of a house any cheaper, and I think that's a challenge that will persist for a period of time.
You're the busiest automotive port importing cars to Australia. Do you see a shift in people's ability to make those big purchases?
We've actually seen really record trade through 2024 come through the port. Motor vehicles have tempered as we've come out of COVID and had a really big flow, and we've seen EVs temper a little bit as well. But overall trade in the port, year on year, 9% growth, 11% growth in exports. While we expect that to temper over time, we think growing population, productivity returning to some of the more normal levels that we'd expect helps to grow that wealth. And that's what we see as underpinning sort of the Australian economy, the Victorian economy, and particularly for us, what's coming in and out of the port. I think that dwelling growth and investment in housing is the other thing that will be really important and support the continued growth coming in. And as we've seen, like price inflation, service inflation has been important, but goods inflation has started to temper really solidly.
Another element in this budget is about the pipeline of talent, the pipeline of workers. What did you see in this that you think might change your ability to get the workers that you need?
Yeah, look, labour constraints have been a real challenge for our industry now for a few years. The announcements around the assistance for more apprentices is very much welcomed. We would have loved to have seen a bit more support for businesses to put on more apprentices as well, but certainly getting a good start there around bringing more people into the industry and setting us up with more labour and talent in the future. It won't happen overnight, but certainly it's a great step in the right direction.
Also, you're building $3 billion worth of infrastructure at the port this year, so you're building as well as bringing stuff in. What did you see in this budget that's going to, shift the dial and make that potentially a bit easier?
I think acknowledgement of the need for private sector funding, partnering with government to take up more of the strain in the long term, that's important, and that's what we intend to do, is deliver the capacity through the port that can feed and facilitate that growth in the Australian economy, particularly the Victorian economy, but also Tasmania, which comes in and out of our port. That acknowledgement of the need for that investment, how important it is to our productivity, and I think an understanding that that investment will come from the private sector over time. That's what we need to see is smoother ability to make the investment, clearer certainty around what we'll do in those investments, and regulation and how that will look over time.
Fantastic. Lee Petchel, Dave McEwen, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Daniel Ziffer in Melbourne there with some terrific insight from big business. Let's go now to Alicia Barry. She's been talking to a pub owner in Sydney's Inner West.
Kirsten, trivia has just wrapped up tonight here at the Balmain, and of course punters have been tackling some pretty big questions and the Treasurer delivering some answers of his own tonight. I'm here with the owner, Troy Phillips. Troy, welcome. Did the Treasurer get it right for small business tonight?
Alicia, I don't think there's a lot there for small business, the way I'm seeing it. They're losing the instant asset write-off. I don't think there's no one's going to be running out and investing in equipment or back in the business on the back of that budget, I don't think.
There was some specific announcements for hospitality with producer rebates for the wine growers and also the freeze on the excise for draft beer. Will that help your margins?
Oh, well, the draft beer excise is great. That was telegraphed. That was needed. I think the punters, the publicans and the brewers are going to love that one. The wine industry is going to like that initiative, and I think gastropubs and restaurants are going to benefit from that. So that's probably a good one as well for the hospitality industry, but the hospitality industry needs it.
When it comes to getting more money in the doors of your venues, do you think the cost of living measures are going to help? Of course, we saw the energy bill rebates extended, albeit a bit smaller, and $17 billion in tax cuts.
I don't know if it's going to flow through. I don't think the energy rebate is going to be enough. I think we need more. We need more than that. I don't think it's going to flow through in hospitality, no.
What kind of measures have you been taking to encourage people to turn up?
Well, early in the week, Monday, Tuesdays, you've got to have an offering. You've got to have some really good food and bev offerings. You've got to do a bit of heavy discounting, and have trivia nights, darts comps. You need to have a lot going on to get people out and about early in the week in Sydney at the moment.
And what's the general mood been? Has it been working?
Yeah, it has been working. People love it. People love good value for money. I mean, pubs offer something for the local community, and they offer really good food, great value food, and it's a really good family and community vibe here in Balmain, so it works for us.
What do you think the government could be doing better to help small business?
Look, I think they did a great job through COVID. The previous government did a great job through COVID, and I think that a lot of small businesses probably got addicted to a free kick. I think post-COVID, small business is really struggling, and Australia's built on the back of small business, and I just think that we need to have a real hard look. I think the Business Council and the government needs to get together ASAP and work out in capital cities how small business, particularly hospitality, go forward, because it's bloody tough out there.
Troy Phillips, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alicia.
So, Kirsten, as you can hear tonight, a bit of disappointment from small business owner Troy Phillips here in Balmain, and perhaps feeling a bit overlooked tonight.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Terrific to hear from you in Sydney this evening. We have some time for final thoughts. Nikki, I'm going to start with you. The opposition leader will deliver his budget in reply speech on Thursday. The PM could call an election as early as this weekend. Are the electoral battle lines any clearer after tonight's budget?
Look, perhaps a little bit. We know cost of living is the number one issue on most people's lips at the moment. And there was a lot in this for the punter to like. Not the cash splash we've seen in the past and pre-election budgets, but enough, I think, to keep people happy. Climate is also an issue. It doesn't get talked about as much, but, and there were some things in there, not a lot. I would have liked to have seen more, but some initiatives in there. So I think they're ticking a few boxes, productivity. But there were no big mistakes. There were no big measures anywhere. But ultimately, if you think about it, the fight often comes down to economic management. And this is more and more budget deficits. And both sides are guilty of the same thing, at least for the last 2.5 decades, of not addressing the structural budget problem that intergenerational reports have identified, and we're no further closer to solving that. So if there is, going to be a fight on anything, perhaps that economic responsibility issue might be one that's grazed.
Shane, what's your view?
Look, in some ways this budget was quite clever in that it took away some of the things that the opposition may have been arguing for, which would have been tax cuts. The government's already doing that. But I think there is still an opportunity there for the coalition to jump in with an alternative, which means smaller growth in government spending. We probably all agree we need to spend more money on NDIS and health and aged care and all those sorts of things, but we've got to find savings elsewhere to make the numbers add up. Otherwise, we're going to have to pay more in tax. And so the opposition could provide an alternative there, which is somewhat smaller government. I wouldn't go down the US path with Trump. That could just open us up to mayhem and disillusionment, and it wouldn't be sustainable. So you've got to be careful there. You've got to do it in a balanced way. But there is an opportunity there, I think, for the coalition. But it has become a little bit tougher with the government talking about the tax cuts. To be honest with you, I agree totally with Nikki. I think the problem we perhaps have is that we grew up in an era when treasurers did pull big things, rabbits out of the hat, Keating, Costello and so on, and budget nights were always times of great excitement in terms of reforming the economy, getting us back on track. And that helped the economy fantastically for decades. Strong growth in living standards, strong growth in productivity, but we're lacking that now. It's all blah, so to speak, very boring, dull. No one wants to do anything exciting. No one wants to pull a real rabbit out of the hat.
So, briefly, Ian, are voters going to take notice of tonight's budget?
I think they'll take notice of the tax cut, and it's clever in a lot of ways because it doesn't kick in for at least another year, so the government can't be accused of doing something that's inflationary. It also wedges the coalition to a certain extent because, as Shane said, it's kind of natural coalition territory to institute a tax cut. In fact, the phase 1, 2 and 3 tax cuts were back from Malcolm Turnbull's days. Look, at some stage I think we've got to come to the realisation that you've got to pay for what you spend, right? So you can either cut back on your spending, but nobody wants to cut back on spending and nobody wants to pay more taxes.
Terrific to hear from you. Ian Verand, Shane Oliver and Nikki Hartley.